I'm gonna admit all the participants and I'll start the intro. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more people to join, and we'll start the workshop. Okay. Just wait a minute or so, since there's still people who are joining.
So are you listening to me, Salvador, as I'm sharing the screen, or am I able to let them in while I share my screen?
You should be able to let them in, yeah.
Okay. So then I'll do that.
Okay. Okay, so it's 10:01, so we can start. Okay. So welcome everybody to the International Workshop on the Risks and Challenges of Neurotechnologies for Human Rights. Technologies such as brain-computer interfaces enable us to read and modify the brain's neural activity and have the potential to improve the treatment of many diseases and disorders. This powerful technology is also being made available to healthy individuals for recreational and mental augmentation purposes. However, the effects of these technologies are still unclear and may pose risks to basic human rights related to mental privacy, identity, agency, equitable access, and others. The goal of this workshop is to explore the risks of these brain technologies and whether existing international legal frameworks are sufficient to protect our human rights. My name is Salvador Dura-Bernal, an assistant professor at the State University of New York. I research neuroscience. My colleagues and co-organizers of the workshop are Marta Sosa Navarro, a researcher in international law, and Carla Gulotta, an associate professor of international law, both at the University of Milano Bicocca. We are very excited about this event and very grateful to our panel of experts who have agreed to participate today. And of course, we are very grateful to all the online attendees who have joined us by Zoom. And the reason we are so excited and happy is that with your help, we now feel that we can achieve two of the main aims of the workshop. So first, we wanted to bring together experts from the very distinct fields involved in this topic. This range from neuroscience to engineering to philosophy and law. And we hope that we can all help each other understand all these different points of view better and hopefully establish a common language. Secondly, we really hope to increase the visibility and public debate of this important topic, which we believe is still unknown for the large majority of the population. We would like to acknowledge the vast amount of work that has already happened in this area over the last years, including the work from several international organizations, such as the International Neuroethics Society or the Neurorights Foundation. As well, the publication of many research papers on the topic and important reports, as well as the organization of multiple workshops and events. Our hope is therefore not just to review the state of the art, but also to build on the existing research and focus on open or controversial questions and try to move some of these ideas forward. Given the impressive background and knowledge of our panel of experts, we are confident we can achieve this. I will now briefly mention some of the logistics of the workshop. So the workshop is structured in 2 days. Each starts at 10 a.m. and ends at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, New York time. Session 1 today will focus on identifying the risks and challenges of neurotechnologies, whereas tomorrow's session, session 2, will focus on examining the current and future regulatory proposals. Marta, if you can show the schedule, please. So each day we will have 15-minute talks by each of the speakers, followed by 15 minutes of questions and discussion between the panel of experts, and as well we'll have questions from the online viewers. So please, if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Please keep the chat free from any other discussion and just use it for questions. If any of the questions cannot be answered during the workshop, we will keep track of them and share them with the experts so they can answer them at a later time. The full schedule of the workshop is being shown on screen, but it's also available at the Eventbrite website. And we would like to emphasize that the entire workshop will be simultaneously interpreted from English to Spanish. So if you want to enable that option, you can go to your Zoom menu and click on interpretation and select the language. Then you will hear the voice of our interpreters. The workshop is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube at a later date. We're also working on a publication with contributions from all the workshop speakers, and we will share more details of this publication later on via email. Thank you so much for everyone, to everyone for being here, and we really look forward to a very exciting workshop. So we will start today with 2 opening talks that will introduce brain-machine interfaces. Each will be 15 minutes long, and they will be followed by a single 10-minute session with questions for both speakers. So I'm very happy to introduce the first speaker, Nima Meskarani. Nima is an associate professor at the Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute at Columbia University. He's a pioneer and renowned expert in auditory brain-machine interfaces. He received the National Science Foundation Early Career Award in 2015, the Pew Scholar for Innovative Biomedical Research Award in 2016, and the Auditory Neuroscience Young Investigator Award in 2019. Among other awards, his research has been selected among the top 10 innovations of the year by UNICEF and top 10 breakthroughs of the year by the Institute of Physics. Please welcome everybody, my friend and colleague, Nima Meskarani. Nima, if you want to try sharing the slides now.
Sure. Let's make sure I share audio. All right. Does it look okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, Salva, for that introduction, and also for the opportunity to speak in this very timely workshop. So what I'm going to do is to hopefully try to set the stage for this conversation by going over some of the recent advances in brain-computer interfaces. And hopefully I will go a bit more specifically into some of the work that we are doing in our lab at Columbia. So this notion of the brain-computer interface is usually in the context of cognitive and sensory motor functions. And our goal here is to somehow try to get close to the brain. And that can be done in many different ways. We can put electrodes on the scalp. We can put electrodes, on the surface of the cortex. We can put electrodes inside the brain. And obviously, this is not the only modality that we can use. Like now, magnets, infrared, ultrasound, all of these are being explored. And by reading this sort of information directly from the brain, we are hoping to replace, restore, enhance, or supplement some kind of a cognitive and sensory motor function. Because, after all, everything that we see, hear, feel, think, do, decide, all of that boils down to a pattern of activity in our brain. So if we are able to directly read that from the brain, then, we can do all kinds of decoding. And also, of course, we can write something to the brain, right, using the same methods. And this can be done to change the pattern of neural activity, to treat a disease, to enhance a function, or to simply just change the neural dynamics. So let me go through some of the recent advances that have been done in this field. One of the one that has been really a long-term goal is the control of a prosthetic arm. And this is a research that goes back a lot. And here what you see is a video of a person with tetraplegia who in 2012 was able to control an arm. And this research has been going through a lot more advances. Here you see a person with 2 electrodes on both sides of the brain controlling an advanced arm to do sophisticated tasks. And in cases, for example, in an amputee that the upper arm is preserved, this could directly read the information from the muscles, and you don't even need to go inside the brain. And they can learn to control this sort of, advanced arms to do all kinds of tasks, such as, playing a piano here. Another popular idea that has been pursued for a long time is controlling virtual objects or avatars. So here is an example, a classic example in this field, that a monkey with electrodes in the brain are able to control an avatar and also feel virtual objects. So they can tell that the shape and the texture of these virtual objects by touching them. So this is a 2-way read and write from the brain. And I presume many of you have seen this video from Neuralink. This is the company that Elon Musk started, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And here's a monkey with an implant in the brain that is seamlessly playing video games. Here's another example that this is also using the muscle activity read by a wristband around the hand. And the person is able to control virtual objects. This company was purchased by Facebook, which is now Meta. And you can imagine that this could be, for example, used for controlling objects in virtual reality, where you are not able to see a keyboard or type. In terms of sensory prosthesis and restoring sensory functions, there has been also a lot of advances. For example, there are these sort of glasses with the camera that are able to write information either directly to the retina or all the way in the back of the head in the visual cortex, and they can restore, partially sight to the blind. Perhaps one of the most used neuroprosthetics is the cochlear implant, which, this idea that if the hair cells are damaged inside the cochlear, the surgeons basically just put an electrode inside the cochlear and directly stimulate those. Here is an interesting example of a brain-to-brain interface, that these 2 mice, their heads are connected. There is a connection between their brains, and together they can solve a puzzle, right? One of them only sees the visual cue, but has no access to the lever. The other one doesn't see the cue, but has access to the lever. And so, by seeing one and then communicating to the other one through the brain activity, together they can solve this issue. And, this sort of application also extends to all kinds of neurological disorders. Parkinson is obviously one that has been known for a long time with deep brain stimulation. And this is now a recent study that also shows that this sort of deep brain stimulation in a closed loop has potential for curing depression. Now, coming to more direct communication examples, this is one of the earlier examples that people were able to control a cursor, for example, to send messages, to surf the web, watch YouTube videos. And in a more recent example, the researchers were able to decode the handwriting patterns from the motor cortex. So as the person is imagining writing with their hand. It's possible to decode those letters directly from the brain, and they achieved 90 characters per minute, which is quite remarkable. For comparison, the device that Stephen Hawking was using was about 1 to 2 words per minute. So this is really a big advance. And here is one of the first examples that the researchers now try to go into the speech cortex. So everything I showed you before was in the hand area, the motor cortex. Right now they are decoding directly from the speech cortex and are able to decode the words, a limited number of words from the brain. And just to show you an alternative way of getting to the brain, it's also possible to not drill and go into the brain. And there's now these technologies that they try to go through the vascular network and get very close to the neural data. And patients with this sort of implants are able to read emails, send emails, and control the web applications. All right, so this was a very quick overview of some of the recent advances that has happened in this area. What our research is more concerned about is the application of these sort of technologies for hearing devices. And this is the motivation that we have. This chart shows you the number of people with disabling hearing loss that is projected to reach 1 billion in the next couple of decades. So it's a huge problem, and what we do in our group is we try to do interdisciplinary work, answer basic science questions in speech neurophysiology, develop new models, and use them for speech-brain computer interfaces applications. So how do we get to the brain? We collaborate with neurosurgery departments here at Columbia, NYU, and also in Long Island at Northwell Health. And whenever they have epilepsy patients that have to go through this sort of epilepsy surgeries, we go, and as these patients are in hospital waiting for their seizures, we get to work with these patients and record their neural responses. And if you're interested in speech communication, obviously this is, this might be what you have in mind. You're sitting somewhere, you're having a conversation, and maybe you happen to be in a soundproof room, but much more likely you are in a real-world situation where in addition to the sound that you're interested in, there are noises in the background, car passing by, other people talking. So in one of the recent studies that we did, we stumbled upon this area in the brain that when we stimulate this part, when we zap this part of the brain, seems like the patient perceives the suppression of the background noise. And here's a video that I let her tell you herself.
Okay, now I'm going to count to 10. 1, and just tell me when you feel a change and what it sounds like. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
5. Oh, it's getting stronger.
What did you feel?
I can hear your voice more and more clear.
You described it. What's the best way you can describe this in 10 words or less?
When you're listening to music and you're trying to adjust the equalizer, the tone, how you hear the music, easiest way to explain it.
Oh, wow.
Would you describe it as, that person comes closer, everybody stays there where they are, or no?
No, it's as if someone just gives that person a mic and just, it kind of like they tell everyone to hush, to turn their background noise down and let this person talk. The family likes fish.
And how was the quality?
5. For me hearing it? Yeah. 5.
Wow. How, can you say more? Like why what?
It's as if you're talking to me right now. Like everything in the back. I heard the noise that started with it, and then as soon as whatever you did, all I heard was his voice.
Yeah, so that's quite remarkable, right? I'm sure you all want to have a device like that, especially if you live in New York like me. And in this perceived report, of course, we tested it also with quantitative methods, and we tested eligibility, and it went from 40% to almost 100% with this sort of stimulation. So this was a huge effect. And finally, this idea of the decoding, that, if you are observing the neural responses in someone's head, is it basically what we are trying to do is to say, is it possible to decode directly the speech from their brain? And one of the applications is that if somebody is unable to talk, we can restore speech. And the other possibility for that, for the sort of application, is in brain control hearing technologies that are connected to your brain. And I will tell you more about that in a minute. But first, let's look at this first idea. How well can we reconstruct speech just from looking at the neural responses? So if somebody is talking, let's say on their phone, we cannot hear what they say, we just observe their neural responses. How well can we do? So this is a method that, the first method is what I came up with about 10 years ago when I was a graduate student. And this is what you get. Yeah, so, you could probably tell that it was a speech, but it wasn't very intelligible. And in this recent work that we did using the sort of deep neural network models, the more advanced machine learnings, this is what we get.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah, so I hope you could tell that these were numbers, and this is really, quite intelligible. We even tested it also objectively. And this other application that I talked about is what happens then if you are in a party or a crowded place, and there are many people talking at the same time. So the speech that's going into your head is, multi-talker, but maybe you're paying attention to only one person. And, maybe halfway through, you hear something interesting from somebody else, and you switch your attention. So in our scientific work, what we found was that if you do that, the speech that comes out of the brain, if you try to read it from the brain, only contains the speech of the person that you're focusing on, as if your brain has filtered everybody else. And this gives us a great idea for a possible hearing aid. Because the current hearing aids in an environment like this are useless. Nobody uses them because they amplify everybody, and that doesn't help. So it really is good to have a system that can tell who you want to listen to and amplify that person selectively. And that's exactly the idea of this sort of technology that we propose, that we have a method of recording the sound, separating all the sound sources, comparing them to the brain responses, and amplifying only the one that you want to pay attention to. So let me play a demo of that. The person is now focusing on the male talker and then switches to the female talker, and we turn on the system at 10 seconds.
How to be a shepherd. Being a shepherd can be a lot of fun, especially when you know how to do it. Shepherds can be found all over the world. Any place from the deserts of Israel to the highlands of Scotland.
The breed of a dog can have significant impact on its personality, as well as its size, health, and required maintenance. For example, long-haired breeds, like collies,
Move
may
to
be
Idaho
beautiful,
or
but they
Wyoming.
require frequent
Buy a
brushing.
sheepdog.
If you do not have time
Some
to devote
sheepdogs
to
are better
weekly
than
or even
others.
daily maintenance,
You would do
you may
best to
need
look on a
choose
dog
different
market
breed.
online or see
The
if you can
American
find a breeder.
Eskimo is
Yeah, so I hope you agree that this could be extremely helpful, especially for somebody with hearing loss, when they can't really separate all the sound sources. All right, so this was a very quick overview of what's going on in the field of BCI that I hope it sets the stage for this conversation of what we need to be cautious about. And this is not my area of expertise, but these are some of the things that I'm sure others are going to talk about in this workshop: privacy, safeguards, informed consent, monetization, the issue of access to latest BCI technology, to make sure no one is left behind, and ultimately the ethics of what happens when the line between human and AI becomes more blurred. And here is the people who actually did the work and our funding sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nima, for that fantastic talk. So we'll have a time for questions after Nathan's talk. I'm sure the audience is very interested in asking you many things about your presentation. Thanks again. So the next speaker is Nathan Copeland. Nathan is a participant in a pioneering research study on bidirectional brain-machine interfaces at the University of Pittsburgh. Over the last 6 years, he has helped shape future technologies that will eventually benefit people in similar situations. Using a brain implant in his motor cortex, he's able to control a robotic arm. Additionally, Nathan was the first person to partially recover the touch sensation through a brain implant in the somatosensory cortex. Nathan also gives talks around the world, including Japan, where he shares his story and insights into brain-machine interfaces. We are very grateful that he agreed to share his unique point of view with us today. Please, everybody, welcome Nathan Copeland.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Let's see if I can share the right screen here. Okay, can you guys see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I guess I'll go ahead and give a quick disclosure here at the beginning. I am now receiving, well, after many years of doing this, I've come to gain a lot of experience. So now I'm a paid consultant for BlackRock, the company that makes electrodes that I have implanted. And I'll actually be joining their ethics board once that gets set up. And while I don't know much about a lot of the, the situations regarding ethics around this kind of stuff right now, kind of hoping that, through watching these presentations the next couple days, I can kind of get to know the state of things. So, like mentioned, my name's Nathan Copeland. When I was 18, I was in a car accident that left me a C5 quadriplegic. It's been about 7 years now that I joined a research study through the University of Pittsburgh. As part of that study, I have 4 of these BlackRock Utah microelectrode arrays. They're each one of these spikes is an electrode. They're a 10 by 10 grid that is about 4 millimeters by 4 millimeters. So they're very small, and they're attached to these pedestals that are mounted on the top of my head. Each one of those spikes can record information from a single neuron. That's what my brain activity looks like sometime after implant. So recording from this population of neurons, I'm able to control robotic arm with up to, I think we've done 9 degrees of freedom, but yeah, this is just the kind of control I could get with controlling a robotic arm. The really cutting edge part of the study is the sensory feedback. So I am the first human in the world to have implants in sensory cortex that they're able to use intracortical microstimulation, basically just little zaps of electric straight into my brain that will elicit a sensation that feels like it is coming from my own hand. So this illustration is the dotted line is the central sulcus of my brain, and then these grids are representations of where the 2 electrodes are in sensory cortex. And each one of these colored squares is an electrode that when they stimulated on, I reported having a sensation coming from the corresponding colored area on the hand there. So most of, well, pretty much all my sensations come from the base of the fingers, and then some are more like the index knuckle and then that kind of area. And I'm told, I'm not, I'm told that, you know, the way that the electrodes and the areas that I feel sensations correspond to, you know, the already known layout of the brain. So my brain is not abnormal. So yeah, the $1 million question that came with me joining the study was, what does it feel like? It's one of those things that I was told many times. There were, you know, probably hundreds of researchers and people around the world that were waiting to hear what I had to say, because, you know, this kind of stuff has been done with monkeys, and they're not very good at explaining things in ways that people can understand, which, you know, makes sense. But so what it feels like, much like how where it feels is completely electrode dependent, but it is also it can change based on the parameters of the stimulation that they use. So the kind of standard that we use most of the time is 100 hertz, and that kind of elicits sensations like tingling and pressure. Things can be warm, and then, you know, when they switch it to 20 hertz, I'll start to feel things that feel like tapping and kind of like some movement around like one of those, like sometimes there's one that's within the purple at the base of my index knuckle, and it'll feel like tapping, but it will feel like it kind of randomly moves around within that kind of square area at the base of my finger. Also, the first time I kind of felt one of these sensations was pretty amazing. I had to do a double take and go like, I think I felt it, and, you know, then they sent the stimulation again, and I was like, I definitely felt it. It's one of those things that I believed, you know, things would work how they said it would, but when it actually happened, it kind of just was still pretty amazing. So the next thing we did with this study was, you know, kind of finish this bidirectional computer interface where my neural signals are driving the robotic arm and hand. Sensors in that robotic hand, specifically torque sensors in the fingers, would let a computer know how much torque was being applied to an object when I would grab it, and then that computer would send stimulation directly into my brain to an electrode that we had already determined felt like a sensation from the corresponding finger. And when we started doing that, we saw that my performance in this task actually improved. The goal of this task is just to pick the object up and put it on the box as fast as you can. If you can do it in under 5 seconds, it's considered like a normal function kind of level. But so when they break down the footage of this, I basically spend the same amount of time translating the hand to the object, but I spend a lot less time basically fumbling around when I'm trying to grab the object. And that's basically because when I only have visual feedback, I can see that the hand is around the object, and I can see that it's touching, but I don't always know how well it is, grabbing the object and how much force that is. So I would go to pick up something and it would fall out, or it would not be in there well. And when I receive sensory feedback, as soon as I've touched the object, I have that extra reassurance that I have made contact with the object, and I don't spend as much time trying to make sure I have exerted force on the object and kind of
Nathan, are you there? Okay, so I think his computer might have crashed, but it happened in the last talk he gave at Columbia that I saw a few weeks ago. So I assume he will join us in a minute again. So maybe we can take the chance to do a couple of questions for Nima Skorani. If anyone from the expert panel or from the viewers, if they want to post any questions in the chat, please feel free. And actually, Nathan is back with us.
Okay, can you guys hear me again?
Yes.
Nice. I switched to my backup computer. I really can't believe this happened twice in a row. So while I'm getting my slideshow back up, I'll just go ahead and continue talking where I was. So I spent a lot less time trying to make sure I had a good grasp of the object, and I just picked it up and moved it. And okay. So next is okay. Okay, can you see that again?
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Nathan.
Skip ahead. So in 2016, I got to meet President Barack Obama and shake his hand. And
I don't know. I know the handshakes that we got to the point where we're going to do fist bumps. Let's see what you got. Blow it up. Blow it up. You want to blow it up? All right. Come on.
And for a few years, that was the coolest thing I had ever got to do with the study. And then in 2018, I got to fulfill my life stream of going to Japan. There was a conference there, and everyone knew I had always wanted to go. So we kind of made plans where I gave a couple presentations at Osaka University and Keio University and this convention, and kind of got it help paying for it through that through the universities, and that will now probably forever be the coolest thing I've got to do because of the joining the research study, and hopefully I can get to go back to Japan one day. Another thing I really wanted to do with the my implants was play games. It's something I always really enjoyed doing. So a couple years ago, I got to play Final Fantasy 14, a game I really liked playing before, and yeah, that was really cool. It's my were put in on Star Wars Day, May 4th. So this was, I think, 3 years ago. I went in for testing that day, and someone had brought in lightsabers. Not quite sure who, but we thought that was the best way to celebrate. So in the other videos, I was using the black arm. That was the first robotic arm I got to use. It was the MPL made by APL. This is a Luke arm made by DECA. I'm 100% sure I can say that I'm the person that has controlled the most robotics with their mind in the world. I've also used a Wham arm. There's a Princilia hand. I got to eat a taco with a exoskeleton glove. And now I'm using a KUKA LBR assembly robot, which is by far my favorite robot. Mostly because it is non-anatomical and it allows me to move within the workspace easier than an anatomical arm that is limited by moving in a way that mimics the way an actual arm moves. So it's mounted by the shoulder, and go certain directions. It can only bend certain joints, and this one can kind of move wherever it wants. Stay parallel to the table, or if I was to reach something on a shelf, that wouldn't really be possible with an anatomical arm. This task was just to pick up the object on the left side and drop it on the right side as many times as I could in 2 minutes, and this was actually my record of 25. One of the big downsides to this technology, and one of the things that's kind of keeping it from everyday use for people that could benefit from it, is the amount of specialized equipment that everything takes. there are, a bunch of computers in that box and specialized equipment that reads the signals and amplifiers, and there's even more equipment if you talk about the stuff that delivers stimulation to my brain, and then you need to have people to run it. And one of the things that is bringing some of this stuff closer to everyday use is this portable tablet that I actually have at home now. I've had for almost 2 years now. I've been able to use it at home independently. It's not very powerful. The CPU is, pretty weak, so I can only do basic things like train a decoder that can be used to emulate a keyboard or a cursor. So basically that means, okay, so this picture was meant to be me using the system at home, and my cat saw the perfect opportunity to jump up. So that is Mojo. But so basically what I can do with this tablet right now is play games, which, is great for me since I've always wanted to. And also, I don't know why these other videos aren't playing. Okay, so the other thing is draw. I really like to draw with it, and I've actually started to put some of my art up as NFTs, and I actually sold one a couple weeks ago that was kind of amazing. So this is just some of my art that I've drawn. This was the one that I sold, and it actually sold for around $11,000, which I was very excited about. Yeah, I really didn't expect that to happen. Let's see. So some of the challenges that I see. So some of these are getting worked on, but like wired connections, obviously there are groups and implants that are using wireless connections now. That will become the norm eventually. But like for my implants, I still have to be hooked up to something. Supporting equipment needs to be a lot less, and it needs to be easy enough to use for either the person that is actually using it or their whatever kind of support system they have with them. It needs to be easy enough that they can use it and troubleshoot basic problems. Another big thing is basically every day I go to use the system, I have to train a decoder, and it doesn't take that long. Basically I just watch a virtual version of the arm or a cursor moving to targets, and I just think along as if I was moving my right arm and hand to those targets, and then it looks at the neural signals and it can build a decoder. But those decoders can be completely unusable after a day, just because of how brains are weird, and signals shift around, and or maybe you don't think about moving my arm to the right in the exact same way that I did the day before, and it just it can throw a decoder off to the point where it can be completely unusable, or it could just be kind of bad, and you might be able to use it for a little while after. But another big thing is if you're talking about a system that uses a robot, there are no robots that are good enough. I've used enough that I can pretty much throw that blanket statement out. Uh, they fail, they break down, just random stuff that they're not meant to be used in a home. Like I could never have a kuka in my house, even though that would be kind of cool. One, it's huge. Two, it's just not practical at all. Like and as far as I know, there's I'm not really in the know with robots, like robot engineering behind the scenes right now. But as far as I know, there's no robots that are even coming close to what I would consider good enough for everyday use. It would be great if there was like a mini kuka that could attach to a wheelchair and help around the house. But as far as I know, there's no one thinking about that kind of thing right now. Let's see. Not quite sure. Not sure how much time I wasted restarting, so I'm kind of getting here's my social media. If anyone can send me an email with any questions that they have, if they don't get answered today, or I just didn't go over them. One thing I'd like to say though is I really joined the study just knowing that it's not meant to benefit me, and it's not like I'm not getting any function restored, and I'm not getting sensation restored, and it's really just the cutting edge, very beginning of this research. And I really did it to help push the science forward and kind of make it so future generations can bypass this kind of period of depression and despair that happens right after you have a catastrophic injury, or I'm sure people that have illnesses or conditions that even progress slower, so it's not one day everything's gone. You just kind of get this feeling like you're not going to ever accomplish anything, and you're not going to be able to do the things that you loved doing anymore. And I want to help push the science forward to the point where the technology is readily available for anyone that needs it, and eventually people that just want it, that don't air quotes need it, eventually it will get to that point. And when it gets there in the future, I don't really mind if people don't remember that I was the first and what my name was or anything. Like I actually hope it gets to the point where it is literally you have an injury and it's like Star Wars, the next day you just if you need a robot hand, you have a robot hand, and it works. And yeah, it's so seamless and I guess common that you don't ever have to think about the road that it took to get to that point. Yeah, I don't know. I'm probably way over time, but that is basically what I had to say. So thank you, and hopefully I can answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I think that's incredibly interesting. I think we're all just fascinated by what you're telling us. And I think it really adds such an important point of view to this debate today. So we are really, really thankful. So yeah, we'll take one or two quick questions. There's actually one in the chat already for Nathan, which I think is really interesting and pertinent to the workshop. So it comes from Javier Palma, and he's asking, so I'd love to ask Nathan about his relationship with the arm. How do you consider this robotic arm an extension of yourself or just a tool?
See, that's one of those complicated questions that I get, because when I'm using it, really the whole, the way it works and the decoder, and like it just is very intuitive to control. So I don't ever have to think any like mental gymnastics, and I don't have to strain. Like it really is just as easy as, thinking, move around and grasp. And so in that way, it is kind of an extension of myself, but I also I see it as a tool, a thing that I'm controlling that is separate from myself. But yeah, people ask about this kind of different kind of connection that some people develop with their kind of devices they use, but I still see it as a tool, but using it is, kind of an extension, I guess. I don't know. It's a complicated question with a weird answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Nathan. I think that's very helpful. So do we have any other questions from the panel of experts, or maybe from any other attendees for Nima or Nathan? The speakers can unmute themselves and ask directly. So I had a quick question for Nima. So what would you say is the main challenge or roadblock in the development of brain-machine interfaces that can process not only sensory and motor signals, but also move into more complex mental processes like decision-making, emotions, abstract thought?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I keep it short in the interest of time, but I would say one of the big obstacles is obviously to get enough resolution and coverage neural recording in the brain. Because currently with all these devices that we have, we are targeting very limited parts of the brain, and considering how the percentage of the neurons that, for example, we are sampling, it's almost close to zero. So for those sort of more complex and abstract things, one of the obstacles is to be able to get enough coverage and resolution from all parts of the brain. And obviously there is also a scientific barrier, which beyond this sort of sensory representations, what's the job of the visual cortex or the auditory cortex or the motor cortex. When we go to more abstract things like thoughts, for example, how they are represented, how they are processed, what's involved in a complex decision making, we don't really know what the neural basis of that kind of cognitive ability is. So to interface with that, I think we need to have a better scientific understanding also of how the brain makes these really complex things happen.
Great, thank you so much, Nima. Okay, so yes, in the interest of time, since we're running a bit late, we are gonna move on to the next speaker. And I think there's 1 or 2 more questions in the chat. So we'll make sure that those reach the speakers. So thank you so much again, Nima and Nathan. Okay, so our next speaker is Eduardo Fernandez-Jover. He's a professor of cellular biology, chairman of the Department of Histology and Anatomy in the University Miguel Hernández in Spain, and the director of neuroengineering and neuroprosthesis unit at the Bioengineering Institute. He has been a visiting professor at several international universities, including Utah, Oldenburg, and Vienna. His research focuses on developing solutions to the problems raised by bidirectional neuroprosthesis and brain-machine interfaces. He also works on brain plasticity and reorganization in severe vision loss. And he has recently published a cutting-edge study showing a cortical implant that enabled a blind person to see simple shapes and letters. Please, everybody, welcome Eduardo Fernandez. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Salvador. It's a real pleasure to be here. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, and today I would like to talk mainly about the challenges and future perspective of intervening the brain. And I would like to focus just on the possibility of providing the human body with new function of capabilities. After seeing the talk of Nathan and Nima, it's not as clearly, it's not a possibility, so it's real. And I would like to focus also on the main biological and technological challenges in this field. So first of all, I think we should be aware that the nervous system is one of the most influential human physiological systems. Virtually every organ in the human body is contacted by a nerve. And then if there is any loss of neural function, that usually causes a significant impairment on health. And I would like also to stress, this is from a book from Siri Husband, The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves. And we are thinking, probably nobody says, I'm a cancer or I'm cancerous, even there is no virus or bacteria, but it's very usual to say something like he's epileptic or I'm bipolar and a schizophrenic. And that's because the illness, the damage of the nervous system are fully identified with us. So we fully identify with this kind of problems. And just briefly, the major constituent of the nervous system are neurons, but in the brain, they are not only neurons, there are many other cells. There are glial cells, there are blood vessels, there are endothelial cells, and for instance, this is just an staining. We inject ink through the blood vessels, and you can see many blood vessels in the brain. So there are many cells. But let's start with the neurons. How our neurons work? And neurons work using electrical signals. In the case of a neuron, there is an stimulus. The stimulus open or close ion channels, and then there is an electrical current through the cytoplasm of the cell, but it's an electrical current. And what's happening in an electronic circuit? In one electronic circuit is also, the information is also an electrical information. In this case, there are electrons that move through a conductor, a metallic conductor usually, but if we think there is electric information at the neuron, electric information at the electronics, so the neural interfaces are relatively simple. The idea is to put in contact the same kind of information, electrical information on one side, electrical information on the other side, and there are many examples. So if we think, for instance, in the pacemaker, we are using pacemaker for more than 60, 70 years now. but there are mainly some devices and neural interfaces for recording signals like BCI, brain computer interfaces, the myoelectric prosthesis, or other kind of prostheses, other kind of technologies are just to send information to the brain, like visual prosthesis, deep brain stimulation, cochlear implants, and so on. And what happened, this is one of the first pacemakers in the world. And this is one of the modern pacemakers. So the physics is more or less the same in both sides, but the technology is quite different. So the technology is improving almost every month. We have something faster and more efficient and so on. And this field, as you know, is progressing very fast. And I think it's because all the recent advances in technology, including microtechnology, microsensor, all the new computing paradigms, low power computing and communication devices, new discoveries in neuroscience and neuroinformatics. So right now we have a better understanding of critical, at least the main brain function, understanding also brain plasticity, multi-neuron population recordings, artificial intelligence, and so on. Of course, the social needs and implications related to aging population, disabilities, and government support for these ongoing research activities. But this is not new. So we think, for instance, Luigi Galvani was one of the pioneers in this field, and he was able, using these all frictional machines, he passed current through the nerve of muscle in animals in this case, and there was some muscle contraction. You can see here in the 19th century, Larry is a French medical doctor. After one amputation, he passed electrical current, and there was also some muscle contraction. And some of the pioneers in this field were really make very complex, I would say, experiment difficult to perform today, like Alessandro Volta. For instance, he introduced two probes of metallic probes inside the ears and switched on the electrical current. And he wrote, I began to be conscious of a sound, or rather a noise in my ears that he cannot define clearly. It was like a cracking, bubbling. So it was really, really dangerous. And this field started, I mean, many years ago. And even at the beginning of the last century, this is from a test from Dura-Bernal. In 1929, he wrote, humans involved in colonizing space should have higher wired electrical interfaces between humans and machines that would allow them to attach a new sense of organ, like just Nathan told us. So the possibility of connecting an electronic device to a brain, even in the sense of enhancement, is not so new idea. So I think that the main goals of central neural prosthesis are, first of all, helping the disabled, people with problems at the brain, at the spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, but also understanding the brain and developing new technologies. And as Nima already showed, we can use different kind of technology. We can use not invasive like EEG, semi-invasive electrocorticogram, but I'm going to focus mainly today on intracortical penetrating electrodes. And we can make, for instance, this is in our lab. So we are controlling a robotic arm just with EEG electrode, but as you can see, the bandwidth is very low. The system is really slow, but it is working. So we can make something with EEG electrodes. Although it's, the videos and the performance of Nathan is really amazing, it's not comparable, but I'd like to show you also other clinical application. And I like this, this is the deep brain stimulation for people with Parkinson's disease, for instance. This is a quite old video, but I like it because this is with the stimulator. This is a person with Parkinson's disease, and you can see is walking very slowly and the tremor, and this person has a stimulator on the brain. The stimulator right now is off and now switch on. you can see that the Parkinson disease is still the same, but the quality of life, the performance, she's able to walk without almost no problem. So the quality of life really improved a lot in this case. Of course, the restoration of hearing is until now the more successful in this field. So as Nima showed us, a patient can perceive auditory information very well. And this, even with no many number of electrodes, and we are working on a similar approach, but for the visual system. So any neurological prosthesis, first of all, the system has to get the same kind of information that the system processes. In this case, we need visual information. So we are developing a kind of artificial inspired retina. Then we have to process that information in a more or less physiological way. And then we have to send the information to the right place. The right place could be the eyes, but there is some person with problems at the eyes or even at the optic nerve. So our target is the brain. And the information from the eyes to the brain doesn't go to the surface of the brain, layer 1, but one deep is approximately 1.5, 2 centimeters, 2 millimeters deep. So we need this kind of electrode, penetrating electrode. So we are using also the UTAS electrode array, and the idea is that the tips, the electrode are going to be very close to the neurons we try to communicate. This is the whole system with the artificial retina, external processing, and so on. And recently, we have been able to try this approach in real blind volunteers. And you can see we are performing bidirectional, we are performing recording and stimulation. This is the real recordings. And we make a stimulation and the patient see, okay, I see some small line, and the patient can make drawings of the perception. And she was even able to read some, to recognize some letters and some shapes. And even here we ask, where is the border between the black and white? It was the first time we switched on the device, and it was really amazing. So it's working. So the systems are able to provide some useful information. So we are expecting some useful information for only for some tasks, for orientation, mobility, for reading big characters. But still, we are still not at the same level that a cochlear implant, auditory prosthesis. Because present visual prosthesis has a limited, first of all, number of electrodes and only emulate some aspects of the visual processing, lack the functionality that is found in the visual system. So there is still many problems. One of the problems Nathan already told about is the system we are using is not a wireless system. So even the UTAS electrode array is quite tiny, but we are using some cables, and this is the percutaneous pedestal. You can see that we have to plug and unplug the system, and this is a potential, there is a potential risk of infections and potential problems. So we should try to develop for the future. We need a wireless system for sure. And another question is, for instance, what happened with a 4-inch electrode enters into the brain? And I would like to show you, this is the UTAS electrode array in humans and acute experiments in human. This is only 4 by 4 millimeters, but when we remove the micro electrode array, you can see some small micro hemorrhages. And this is the histology. You can see these are the electrodes. There is many healthy neurons around and glial cells. But nevertheless, there is a consequence of the insertion, there is a mechanical damage. We broke the blood barrier interface, there is an ischemia, some vascular lesions, some damage of the neurons and other cells, and there is an acute inflammatory reaction that sometimes it transforms into a chronic inflammatory reaction. So you can see this is an acute implant and some damage around the implant sometimes, or in this case, there is no damage because fortunately this kind of damage recovers just in 1 or 2 days, but there is a proliferation of cells. So if this is the case, every time it's more difficult to get signal from the neurons around or to send information, to send electrical information. And that's what happened in some, this is animal experiments. You can see many electrodes are completely okay like this, but in this other electrode, there is a chronic inflammatory reaction. So there is a big problem. I mean, biotolerability or long-term biocompatibility still is a big problem in this field. So some of the current limitation of the wireless communication, I think that for the future, we need bidirectional communication. We also need to sense or to provide information from outside, both with high number of electrodes. The number of electrodes we are using right now is quite limited. For instance, every eyes send more than 1 million axons to the brain, and we are using right now 100 electrodes. The neural interfacing is far from mimicking the real anatomical and physiological connections. We still have problems related with information coding strategies. There are technological challenges related with power, size, flexibility, integration and miniaturization, the package of electronic. We need to develop one stable and reliable neural interface. And there is the problem related with biocompatibilities. And this is very important also, a better understanding of brain plasticity, because these kind of devices can also change the brain. And I would like to show you some small sample. We had the opportunity to study Neil Harbinson. Neil Harbinson has achromatopsia. He's looking the world in black and white, like this. And he's using right now this device. So he's using the eyes to see the shapes, what is outside, and he's using this microphone to listen and to convert to see the shapes, but it converts into colors, and the colors into auditory signals. And the problem, for instance, is you can see this is the metro in Barcelona. In color, it's more or less easy, but in black and white, it's more difficult. But what about this is the metro in Tokyo? It's quite difficult. But at the other side, you can see, you can differentiate the flags of several countries. But you see, for instance, this is the flag of France, Italy, Ireland, and in black and white, all are the same. So this is Neil, and he claimed he is the first cyborg in the world. And this is the passport. You can see the picture of the passport with the microphone over here. And as I told you, information of the shapes comes from the eyes, but information from the colors can from this microphone and goes directly, in this case, to the auditory cortex. And when we make a function, fMRI, it will happen, high magnification, you can see when we perform either auditory stimulation or visual stimulation, there is an activation on both areas. This is auditory areas, and these are visual areas. And what's happening? What's happening in the case of Neil, you can see this is the auditory area, this is the visual area, and there is a lot of connections between auditory and visual area. This is a control subject, these are two control subjects, and there are also many connections from this to the frontal areas. This frontal fasciculus, there is a kind of new connections that are growing or are changing the brain probably because of the use of this kind of devices. So today is really amazing. This is Nathan, and the experiment with Nathan are really amazing. These are some experiments in our lab with exoskeleton. We have a robotic arm into a wheelchair, and we are using for some, we are controlling the wheelchair, in this case with EEG. This is our Berna Gomez, our subject, blind subject. But the future could be really, really amazing. These are from some scientific movements, and nobody knows really what's going to happen in the future. But I think we should start thinking on this, because the possibility of providing the human body with new function of capabilities is not limited to science fictions like developments. And also right now, the implants resulting in enhancement are not part of today clinical reality. There is a clear possibility for the future, and I think that we should be ethically prepared. So there are some questions, for instance, when should we intervene in the brain of a person? What type of intervention are acceptable? What criteria should we use to design and evaluate experiments related with the neurotechnologies? And I think that never in the history have been so many new findings concerning neural interfaces as has been in the last 20 years. Still, we are at the beginning of the way. There are still many questions to be solved, but we can expect that at least for some persons, effective device and system will be developed during the next years. And one of the topics on this field that will be debated in the next years is the meaning, advantage, and disadvantage of the neurotechnologies. I think that one of our mission is to anticipate within advance what can be a problem and try to provide clear ideas and guidelines to deal with all these potential issues. These are some of the people working in our lab. Of course, it will be impossible without the people in our lab and all the collaboration that we are performing right now. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Thank you. That was fascinating again, and I think it's really useful to see the perspective of someone who's so knee-deep into these technologies and developing really themselves in the lab and with real patients. And I think it's also really interesting the limitations that you mentioned, all the problems that we have right now, which are not really highlighted usually, but it's really an overwhelming list as well. So do we have any questions maybe from some of the other speakers, or any comments or questions from the audience? So there's a question here in the chat from Oscar. He's saying, I'm wondering what happens to people's society if we have neural interfaces that can modulate subjective experience. If dopamine, serotonin are under personalized control, do we even need each other anymore? What about addiction?
Well, I have no clear answer about this. But I mean, we are already using this. For instance, what's happening with the people using Ritalin of any other drugs. So they are making, they are better in some way. They have some better capabilities. And we are already using this in real life. This is no, it's neurotechnology in some way. We are not using microelectronics for this, but nevertheless is neurotechnology. And also it's possible that through neurotechnology, by making electrical stimulation, we can induce the release of several neurotransmitters and so on. So probably we can modify it. And it has been already done. For instance, I remember Jose Maria Delgado is an old researcher from Spain that so he makes more of the experiments in the States. He was using electrical stimulation to stop one bull. So he, I mean, the people, I mean, one animal to stop. I mean, the animal was running through him and make an electrical stimulation, and suddenly the animal stopped. So we can control in some way the aggressivity and so on. And there is some people using this kind of technology just for controlling the aggressivity, or just the opposite, to controlling depression. So I think it's feasible, but still we need more knowledge about all these issues. And we have to think on the possibilities, because, okay, we can also use this kind of device, but what happens with the person that doesn't use this kind of devices? Are less, or because it's everybody is using Ritalin, the people that is not consuming Ritalin is in another condition. So if 50% of the population right now has a brain implant and is able to make whatever, what happens with the remaining 50% are less humans because the new humans are going to have all the implants. I don't know. I think we have to think, I think that we have time to think because, I mean, we still have many problems. Even, I mean, we are at the beginning of the way. And as Nathan already said, so even the robots are not perfect, are huge. So you just for almost nothing, you need a whole room full of computers and amplifiers and recording system. But in the future, probably in 20 years, we can have everything with the size of a mobile phone. So, I mean, it's feasible. So, and the technology is improving very fast. So I think it's time to think and start working or start thinking and making regulations. And maybe nobody, I mean, not everybody needs this kind of implants or this kind of technology. We also, from the medical doctor, from the medical point of view, we need to set up indications. For instance, we have a given patient and which kind of implant should we decide or should we recommend? There is not indication for this. Right now, it depends on the group. If you are living close to a stage and close to one lab that is making whatever, the possibilities to use that technology is much higher than if you are living in Spain or in Germany or something like that. But for the future, I think we need indication. I mean, the technologies, if for using the technologies from my point of view, is mainly for improving the quality of life. I think we can improve the quality of life, but of course, we can also use the technology for other things, enhancement. And I feel right now we are very far away, but I don't know. I should start thinking on this as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. I think, yeah, these questions are really starting to touch into all the ethical issues that the workshop is about. So, I think we have maybe time for another quick question. And we thought this one was interesting in terms of enhancement. So they asked, for the future, might these technologies allow us to see other spectrums, such as the ultraviolet?
It's not for the future, that's feasible today. For instance, I mean, we have a system and we are using a kind of a biocamera. And from the biocamera, we can get infrared information, ultraviolet information. That's feasible. So we get the information. Our eyes are not working with ultraviolet or infrared information. But since we are using a microelectronic device, we can get information from this and send to the brain. For instance, Neil Harbinson, this person that with the implant, he has a Bluetooth device and he's taking information from the space station. He claimed that he's the only person in the world that is taking information directly from the space station. So that's feasible today. But the utility for this, for me, has no utility, it's not helpful.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really a world of opportunities that we have with these technologies. Okay, so I think we can probably move forward, and we'll have chance to involve also Eduardo in the next discussions. So thank you so much again, Eduardo Fernandez. There's a couple more questions in the chat that we will pass along to you, and thank you again for your talk.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Nita Farhani. Nita is a professor of law and philosophy. She's the founding director of the Duke Science and Society and the chair of the Duke Masters in Arts in Bioethics, Science and Policy. She's a leading scholar on the ethical, legal, and social implications of emerging technologies. Farhani is a frequent commentator for national media and radio shows. She presents her work to diverse audiences, including the World Economic Forum, TED Talks, the National Academies of Science workshops, among others. In 2010, she was appointed by President Obama to the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues and served until 2017. She is president-elect and board member of the International Neuroethics Society, a member of the Neuroethics Working Group of the US Brain Initiative, and the Global Precision Medicine Council for the World Economic Forum, among several others. Farahani is also the recipient of the 2013 Paul Bator Award, given annually to an outstanding legal academic under 40. Thank you so much, Professor Farahani. Please, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Let me just make one correction. I clearly have not updated my bio recently enough, which is I am the immediate past president of the International Neuroethics Society. We have a wonderful new president in place, Joseph Fins, and I encourage you all to be engaged with the INS. It has a terrific organization and a lot of people who are interested in these topics. I'm going to speak with you a little bit about, I think, something that's going to be covered in a good bit tomorrow, which is the intersection between neurotechnology and cognitive liberty. I'm currently writing a book called The Battle for Your Brain, which really tries to help to define and work through a number of the interesting new opportunities and challenges that neurotechnology presents for individuals, for society, and for governments, and tries to look at what the the bundle of rights are that we need in order to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks of emerging neurotechnology. My focus really is on consumer neurotechnology rather than the broad set of neurotechnology that's developing. And the reason is because that's what I think will become the most ubiquitous. A lot of the technologies that we were talking about earlier today that are extraordinary enabling technologies are more likely to remain for now in the medical realm rather than something that's available to the average individual. So the kinds of risks that those pose are going to be different, I think, in kind than the kinds of risks and benefits that are posed by the novel consumer-based neurotechnology. So the framework for me, as I really think about the broad set of rights that we need, is to start with something like On Liberty from John Stuart Mill, which helps us think a little bit about the different categories of rights and how we ought to think about them. And that's of liberty and thought, of discussion, of the individual, that is vis-a-vis themselves, of limits of society over individuals, so how corporations and others interact with and intersect with the individual, of limits of government over individuals, and then thinking broadly about what a right to cognitive liberty would look like that would address these different contexts.
I'm sorry, we're not seeing your slides. I'm not sure we're seeing this. Like a wide...
I have screen sharing. I can stop and try sharing again.
Thank you.
Do you see them now?
Oh, yes, now it's perfect.
Okay, great. You didn't miss much. You missed a pretty front slide. And here's the first slide, which is just words. All right, so now we'll dive in. Thank you for letting me know. So let me start with the first category, which is really thinking about the limits and the benefits and the opportunities for individuals. And I think about this in two ways, which is increasingly neurotechnology is going to enable people to have access to their own brain waves and their own brain information. So we have long had access to that through self-reflection and introspection, but the ability to visualize, to quantify, and to actually see objective data about our brains is both exciting and presents with it new opportunities for us to be able to modulate, address, and intervene in our own brains. The risk that I see to our cognitive liberty is that much like other technologies that have been marketed direct to consumers, take, for example, direct to consumer genetic technology, there's an increasing movement afoot to try to restrict direct access to individuals for technologies, particularly ones that promise to give you insights and information about the brain that could be relevant to health or well-being. So, for example, 23andMe, when it marketed its technology for direct-to-consumer access that contextualized and gave information to consumers, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and other regulators worldwide tamped down on what they were doing, limited the kinds of information that they could provide, and created the kind of trusted intermediary that stood between consumers and access to their information. I see the same thing happening with neurotechnology already, and it's based on a claim that individuals lack sufficient health literacy to be able to access information themselves. I believe that approach to neurotechnology is discriminatory. It is akin to the kinds of claims that people have long made about voting, arguing that people lack sufficient literacy to be able to exercise an effective vote, which I believe is an elitist and discriminatory approach to individuals. So one aspect of cognitive liberty is the right to self-access, and that is the right to access information about your own brain. There's a number of technologies that are coming onto the market that are going to make that increasingly more possible. Whether that's a consumer headband like this one from Muse or Insight, the many other companies that are starting to market things like in-ear EEG devices or EMG devices, even the possibility of things like FNIRS and other technologies that would enable people to gain access to their own brain data. We have to think now about what kinds of information consumers should have access to, and what kinds of requirements, therefore, there ought to be placed on corporations from a regulatory perspective that would ensure that the quality of information that individuals are getting is high quality information and relevant information. So for example, going back to the 23andMe example that I gave you already, the FDA in the United States has required consumer comprehension studies when a new kind of information or indication is pushed out to consumers. That same kind of thing with neurotechnology could substantially improve the literacy and understanding of consumers while also giving them direct access to information about their brains, which I believe they have a right to access. And as you know, the kinds of information that we can start to decode is becoming increasingly more precise and increasingly more exciting. Whether it's this study from 2011 that looked at decoding using fMRI, facial images that focus just on the visual cortex of the brain, or newer EEG studies that suggest that we can also decode visual imagery from the brain, even with a few consumer-based electrodes, or start to decode speech using something like EMG that would allow you to virtually type on a keyboard. What that means is there's going to be richer and more provocative information that we can decode even using simple devices like EEG technology, which can enable people and empower people to do things like be able to interact with their technology without their traditional peripheral devices, or learn things about their health or improve their own well-being through neurofeedback. But of course, we can not only do things like access our brains, we can change them. Okay, not the brain of a mouse or a rat here. The reason that you're seeing this particular rat is that this is Hobby J, who's a Long Evans rat, the smartest that may be known. And this Hobby J was transgenically modified in order to increase neurons that would enable him to remember better. And of course, there are increasing opportunities to do that for humans as well, not necessarily through transgenic modification, but through access to drugs and devices that can improve and modulate the brain. But just like there is a threat to self-access, there's also a threat to the right to alter oneself and questions about the limitations about what we can do. I believe we ought to have a right to enhance ourselves, that is part of what it means to flourish as human beings, and better and more precise technology that enables us to do so ought to be something that we embrace as a society rather than treating them as if they're cheating or morally impermissible. But just as we can enhance, we can diminish. A drug like propranolol can be used. It's a traditional beta blocker that many people take just for ordinary heart conditions, but it can also be used to do things like disaggregate fear memories from declarative memories. What that could mean is that a person who suffers from a traumatic event, if offered a drug like propranolol, could consolidate the memory without having, for example, the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder that many of them would otherwise develop. But should they have the right to diminish their brains, is there a right or a claim that society has, for example, to have a witness preserve their memories such that we can convict a rapist or an assailant in another case? Is there a right to diminish just as there is a right to enhance? And I believe this is a more difficult question, but one that on balance ought to favor a person's right to diminish themselves within limits that society could place, which is to say that cognitive liberty will not be an absolute right. It's the kind of right that will have to balance societal interests against individual interests. That brings us to the limits of what society can do over individuals. And in this realm, what I'm really focused on and thinking about is issues about the use by corporations of technology that is focused on the brain. And that could be in the context of commercial monitoring of the brain, such as, for example, is happening in the context of monitoring truck drivers for fatigue levels or monitoring fatigue levels of individuals who are commercial drivers in commercial settings. Increasingly, there's a move afoot to start to monitor the attention, the focus, and even the emotional landscape of individuals who are within the workplace. There's also a move to take all of that data and to start to commodify it, package it, and resell it, just like commercial actors and corporate actors are commodifying, packaging, and selling all kinds of other data. Well, should there be limits on what commercial actors can do with respect to our neural data? Is there a right to mental privacy? And if there is, which I believe there is, as one of the bundle of rights that exists within cognitive liberty, how do we enforce that as a society? And if we believe that mental privacy can sometimes be yielding in the interest of society, for example, if you have a commercial driver who is fatigued and the only piece of information you're picking up from their brain is whether or not they're tired, and that could avert substantial accidents and cost of accidents to society, should we allow that intrusion into their mental privacy in order to safeguard society? I believe that we may wish, under a public health rationale, to do so, which is to say, again, that cognitive liberty won't be absolute, but figuring out when it's permissible because the interests at stake are lives, versus when it's impermissible because all we're doing is maximizing the productivity and the bottom line revenue for a corporation by monitoring brain activity. That balance is one that we'll have to develop as neurotechnology continues to be developed and employed in commercial settings. And it matters contextually where it's happening. What if the kinds of monitoring of workers and in the commercial setting is happening through state-sponsored surveillance? And how is that information being used if it's being fed, for example, into social credit systems that can be used as a way to oppress individuals rather than to improve workplace conditions and to improve the well-being of society? Which brings us then to another area, which is not just accessing the brain again, but altering the brain, and here by corporate actors. And the question in this context is, where is the limit and where is the line between what is considered persuasive versus what is considered manipulative? Traditionally, until now, we have recognized that advertisement is designed and targeted to change our minds. The very purpose of advertisement is to encourage us to make purchases and to change our consumer behavior. But is there a moment at which using information from the brain more directly or more targeting crosses a line? Maybe because it's more effective, maybe because it's picking up information that we wouldn't otherwise reveal, because it violates mental privacy, or because it changes how we would otherwise behave more so than traditional marketing practices would. This is an incredibly, if not most difficult line for us to identify, but certainly there's a right to be safeguarded against explicit manipulation of the brain by corporations, even if there isn't a right to be safeguarded against persuasion of the brain, which is part of what the ordinary practice and engagement is within humanity. maybe it's just good marketing. Maybe accessing the brain of individuals leads to better, more targeted products that are delivered to us. Or maybe it bypasses our control and our choices about what we share and when we share it in ways that go beyond what is good marketing and crosses the line into manipulation. I believe there's a right to be safeguarded from manipulation, but drawing that line will be one of the great challenges of the era of neurotechnology. Which brings us to the third category, which is the limits of governments over individuals. And here again, the question is, what will governments do in order to gain access to and try to alter the brain? I believe governments are all in on trying to access the human brain. And one small example of that is the increasing focus on biometrics worldwide by governments and the use of biometrics as a form of authentication and identification of individuals. It turns out that neural signatures may be one of the best and most unique forms of authentication and identification of individuals, and governments are investing heavily in past thoughts, in arriving at borders and using something like your neural signature of singing a little ditty in your head as a way of being able to identify and authenticate you. Well, that's potentially exciting because anything we can do to increase security and move away from traditional password-based security is probably good for society. But it also means that suddenly governments may have a right to access things like your raw brainwave activity. And when that happens, what does that mean for freedom of thought? What does it mean for self-censorship and the risk that it introduces when governments now have a right to access your brain activity as part of the way to authenticate and identify you? And of course, it's not just for accessing the brain to identify you, but also potentially to interrogate you. Worldwide, there have been attempts to use things like brainwave activity, whether it's through a P300 wave that looks at recognition memory or other kinds of brain data to try to detect guilt in individuals and to try to interrogate the brain directly. We've always looked for the truth serum, some way to be able to identify and understand individuals. And some of my earliest work in this space looked at whether or not rights like the right against self-incrimination or the right against unreasonable search and seizure that are within the US Constitution would be relevant and safeguard us against the use of neurotechnology to interrogate the brain. What I concluded is that it's unlikely to be successful to have the existing legal frameworks protect us. And that's because when you're getting information from the brain, it's more like the other kinds of physical and real evidence that we already allow people to collect from the body, like voice prints or hand prints or even things like blood alcohol levels. It's just blood flow. And it isn't the kind of thing that is treated as traditionally as the self-testimony that a person gives against themselves, but I believe that it should be. I believe that interrogating the brain presents a fundamental threat to our freedom of thought, but also enables the government to access the one space that is utterly essential to all other freedoms. Freedom of speech is one of the most fundamental freedoms that we have, but freedom of thought precedes that. If you cannot think freely, how can you ever think a thought like coming together to rise up against a tyrannical government, to resist unfair and illegitimate policies? How can you ever be free if you can't think freely? Which brings us to the last category, which is what happens when governments attempt to not only interrogate or access the brain, but also to do things like alter it. Already, there are things like electronic sentencing alternatives. So instead of a person serving an incarceration, doing things like giving them some kind of drug that changes their testosterone or hormone levels, or biometric monitoring of them, which would allow them to integrate back into society without being imprisoned. But there are also discussions and controversies over concepts like the so-called Havana syndrome, a claim of a direct and targeted attack on the brain, which scientists continue to debate as to whether or not it's psychosomatic or something actually occurred. But the idea that it's on the table, that alteration of the brain, whether it is through a punishment or targeting the brain of an enemy, is something that is being considered and debated means it's time to recognize a right that would safeguard us against a targeted attack on our cognition and our emotions. Which brings us to the bundle of rights that are cognitive liberty. I worry that people do not understand the implications of the threats that neurotechnology presents. They are focused on the promise and don't recognize the threats. In my lab at Duke, we ran a study to try to understand the extent to which people treated their different information that could be gathered from brainwave data the same as they treat other sensitive information. This was a study done in the United States, and unsurprisingly, given the kinds of information and training that people receive, what they thought was the very most sensitive was their social security number. More sensitive than their mental thoughts in their mind, the image content in their mind, things like their sleep patterns and political views or other kinds of information that we might be able to decode through neurotechnology. I think this is because people don't really understand or appreciate the implications of being able to decode, access, and alter the brain. And as a result, it means that people may more willingly or unwittingly give up their brain data and their brain information, which is why the time has come for us to recognize a right to cognitive liberty. As I said, I don't think existing constitutional protections or international human rights protections are sufficient or adequate, because they don't contemplate the world in which you could truly access and alter not only your own brain, but have that access and altered by corporations and government. That means we need to recognize a right to mental privacy and mental integrity. We need to bolster freedom of thought. Fortunately, recently, the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Thought provided a new report to the General Assembly in October that really advocates for an expansion of freedom of thought, including contemplating the implications of freedom of thought for neurotechnology. But we also need to recognize the importance of self-access and self-determination and mental integrity as part of that principle. It's critical that people have the right to access information about their own brain and be able to make choices about how they alter and change their own brain. Consent is always a part of the conversation, but it is never sufficient, particularly in a context like this, where people have such a thin understanding of the implications. And when consent has become such a blanket form of engagement of individuals rather than a truly knowing form of informed consent. And we have to balance the risks and benefits. We have to recognize that cognitive liberty will not be an absolute right. It will have to be a right that takes into account the interests of society. There may be instances in which cognitive liberty yields to a strong public health rationale that allows limited intrusion into the mental space of an individual. But when that happens, we have to make sure that it is the least intrusive and most safeguarded form of intrusion. That brings me to the model of cognitive liberty, the idea that it is a bundle of rights. It's a set of sticks. It's a header that takes into account the broader set of sticks, which only matter if we truly work them out in context, apply them, and then try to understand on a country-by-country basis, on a state-by-state basis, what exactly that will mean for individuals, for corporations, and for regulators. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Farhani. That was a fascinating talk and incredibly clear, I thought, and very thorough, covering all these topics. I think it was a really good segue from the more neuroscience aspects to the ethical issues, which are obviously really broad. So if we have any questions from either the speakers or...
I see a question in the chat, which is, on what normative foundation can we base the right to enhance oneself, considering the law's is ought distinction? Is human flourishing the only basis for an ought claim? And I think that I would base it in a couple of ways. One is, I believe it's part of human autonomy, the right to enhance oneself. I think that the right to enhance oneself is different than a lot of the other ought kinds of claims there are out there, because I believe it's fundamental to what it means to be human, to constantly be expanding our horizons and our brains. And so when people look at cognitive enhancement and say, no, there are reasons that a person ought not be able to enhance, I think it ignores the human condition. The very basis of the human condition is constantly stretching, changing, exposing, interacting, and broadening what constitutes our mental capacity and experiences. And so for me, enhancements is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And that's part of why I think it's such a critical part of cognitive liberty, is it's a recognition of it being a core part of what it means to develop identity and to be self-determined human beings. Somebody says, in order to imagine the substance of these neuro rights, is it possible to use the principles from our experience of bioethics to choose our boundaries? So first of all, I strongly resist the word neuro rights. And so let me just start there, which is the reason I use the term cognitive liberty rather than neuro rights is that I think neuro rights is too narrow. It is also too broad. Everything in the world could fall under neuro rights if you start to frame it that way. If we want to talk about what the rights you have in your cognitive and affective experiences are, which is what I'm really talking about, I think a better terminology would be cognitive liberty. I was working with a group last week where we were talking about really changing that language from neuro rights to thinking about something broader like minding rights, and thinking about how we ought to mind rights much more generally rather than focusing on neuro rights. So I'll start there. But then is it possible to use principles from our experience of bioethics? I do think it is. I think that bioethics, frankly and honestly, is in a little bit of a crisis point of principlism, which is that principlism is useful insofar as it allows us to reach pragmatic and clear understandings of what the next steps are, what we ought to do as a result. And I think that while those principles may be reflected in coming up with a set of cognitive liberty bundle of rights, they are at a level of abstraction that is too high to be applied and useful in context. And so I always turn to look at the principles of bioethics like non-malevolence, justice, self-determination, autonomy, but I also recognize that there are different forms of that worldwide, whether you are coming at it from an individual focused bioethics or a Western, kind of the Western approach, or a more Eastern communitarian ethics, and believe that a liberty framing is more helpful to us to drive toward pragmatic set of cognitive liberty bundle of rights. I have somebody asking, is there a more quantitative description of the red, blue, and white brainwaves? I'm not sure if that's directed at me or not. I don't think I talked about red, white, and
probably not.
Yeah. Do we have a responsibility to educate the people who are developing these technologies in the first place to make sure they establish boundaries? Yes, absolutely. So I believe that we absolutely need to educate technologists, and we need to have ethics by design. So from my perspective, I'm writing a book called The Battle for Your Brain that really goes through the details of cognitive liberty on a kind of dilemma by dilemma basis that really tries to unpack each of these bundle of rights. And a lot of my recommendations are targeted toward the development of the technology itself, because I think there are things individuals can do, there are things corporations and developers can do, there are things governments can do, there are things that international human rights organizations and others can do, and that we need people across that full spectrum to be engaged to truly and ultimately be able to secure to individuals the right to cognitive liberty. And so part of the responsibility to educate people could be things like I was talking about, like the comprehension studies. You could imagine if you had to do A/B testing of, do you truly understand what this means that I am releasing, or what this signature of fatigue means, or what this signature of this delta band means, or things like that. And you educate consumers about what that means, but also what the broader implications are. That could be incredibly helpful. And also, they need to be building ethics into the products themselves, giving users control at the device level, considering things like overwriting the data and keeping raw brainwave data directly on device that is overwritten rather than is transmitted back to an app and to a corporation who can use and commodify it in certain circumstances. And so I think there's a lot of layers of actual applied recommendations that we need to get to about what developers should do, what individuals should do, what governments should do, and what international human rights organizations should do. How do we see this in terms of international governance frameworks, a new global human rights instrument on cognitive liberty, a changing existing human rights framework? That's a really great question. I think it would be useful to articulate a global human right that is cognitive liberty. Now, that being said, that can be very difficult to achieve, and I am also a pragmatist. And so if every one of the pieces that are within the bundle of rights was updated to recognize cognitive liberty instead, right? If freedom of thought explicitly says, and this addresses cognitive liberty, and freedom of thought ought to address the following kinds of circumstances that could be interfered with as a result of neurotechnology, or the principle of autonomy, which is recognized in existing human rights regimes, or the principles of mental integrity and self-determination. If those were simply updated and we had an understanding that those are the bundle of rights that go into cognitive liberty, I think that would be fine as a successful approach. I don't think we need to necessarily recognize and adopt new rights to make it happen. We just need to make sure that those rights map onto a conceptual framework of cognitive liberty. And that's probably more successful, right? Rather than trying to get everybody to adopt a cognitive liberty or so-called neuro rights or things like that. It's instead just having an organizing principle that people recognize and reflect in each of those existing kinds of rights, and then recognize these new threats to them and the new applications to them. So I'm using the term cognitive liberty deliberately as a conceptual framework of a bundle of rights. Those bundle of rights could be updated, and that would be sufficient so long as the organizing principle is echoed throughout and people recognize that organizing principle in each of those individual pieces of that bundle of rights. All right, it's already hard to get a globally shared interpretation of rights and freedoms like FOE, freedom of expression, privacy, with today's mainstream technologies. What can we do differently to be more successful in this case? Or do we simply accept cultural differences will be significant challenges to achieve that common understanding? There will be some cultural differences, and that's okay, right? There are different cultures and there are different ethics in different cultures, and that's okay. There are some truly fundamental freedoms, like freedom of thought, though, that I believe are the basis of all other freedoms. Privacy may be different in different contexts, where some people and some cultures are less privacy favoring than others. So what do we do to be more successful? I do think that the approach that I was just talking about that may be more successful is to recognize that trying to push through novel tech-specific or domain-specific rights may be very difficult, right? So like if every new technology that comes out, you say like, okay, this requires a whole new human right. It's just like, we're going to be playing catch up for the rest of our lives and we're never going to actually succeed. But when new technologies place pressures on existing shared norms, like freedom of thought, right, which has traditionally been very limited and focused on freedom of religion, we need to re-examine those norms, update those norms, and then include those updated norms in the international human rights language and regimes. Then the hard work begins, okay? That's the easy work, actually. Then the hard work is then saying, and what does that mean in a context by context specific basis, right? So if an employer is asking a truck driver to wear a EEG headset while they're driving their truck, does that violate their right to mental privacy? Does it violate their freedom of thought? And we have to answer context by context and then develop implementing legislation that addresses the context, recognizing those principles. And so I think it's going to vary because different countries have different situations. They have more robust employment protections and less robust employment protections, more robust anti-discrimination laws and less robust anti-discrimination laws, greater privacy protections and less privacy protections. But if we can articulate the shared norms at an international level and then make recommendations at a country-specific level about implementing legislation by context, I think we're much more likely to gain traction than trying to kind of constantly get out there saying like, okay, we need a new set of rights that address this new context. I don't see more questions, and I think I've probably taken up more time than I am supposed to. And so I thank you all for your questions and your engagement. And yield to the next person who is up with gratitude.
Thank you so much, Nita. I was going to make an announcement that the last speaker, Marilisa Levitrano, won't be able to make it today. So we have a bit more of flexibility with the schedule. We're actually going to take the break after this period. I actually had a question. So you mentioned the right to enhance oneself should really be encouraged. And this, of course, brings the issue of equitable access. So will the rich just be superhuman and the rest of the poor people not? So how would your cognitive liberty address this issue?
So first of all, recognize that most forms of enhancement that exist today, like excellent education, access to tutors, nutrition that is high quality nutrition, exercise and access to exercise. These are all cognitive enhancers. Private tutors, add-ons to education, none of these things are equitably distributed today. And that is a problem worldwide, right? We have great inequity in how people have access to be able to enhance their brains in all of the ordinary technologies that we have available today. Not everybody has access to iPads and tablets and learning games, great computers, great phones, and there's just a very poor distribution of those resources worldwide. Now, some people would say, okay, well then let's target drugs and devices to the brain and say, everything else is inequitable, so let's not let this one be inequitable. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. It is part of the spectrum of the many different devices and technologies that exist within society that we can use to enhance our lives. And so I don't think the technology is the problem. I think our maldistribution of goods and resources is the problem. And so if the concern is how do we address inequity in society, then address the core inequity in society, not by banning access to some new promising technology or new drug, but instead figuring out ways to try to address core inequities. And if we discover, for example, that certain drugs are even better than anything else that's out there, right? Like you could have a tutor or you could have modafinil, and modafinil would enable your learning, 800%, and the tutor improves your learning 20%. Well, I mean, that probably ought to guide us to making modafinil widely and cheaply available to everybody, rather than prioritizing a tutor for everybody, right? And so we ought to look at the set of tools that we have to help people enhance and improve their lives, and then invest in making those cheaply and widely available rather than behind regulatory barriers. And I'll just add one note, which is the more regulatory hurdles there are to access to these devices, the more expensive they are, and the less likely the poorest and least networked will have access to them. In the United States, if you go to a college campus, the use of cognitive enhancement drugs are rampant, but the way that students get access to them when they don't have an indication, for example, for something like ADHD, is their wealthier parents can find them a doctor who will prescribe it for them. And the students who don't have that kind of access are unable to get the legitimate prescription, and then they don't have access to the drugs. And that dichotomy exists right now, right? So instead, if you focused on the core problem, which is the equity issues, the restrictions of access issues, rather than trying to ban the thing, I think we'd make much greater headway toward equity in society.
Fantastic. Thanks so much again for all your excellent questions and your presentation. So we're gonna take the break now. It's around 12:10 now, so we'll be back at 12:25 in 15 minutes. And we'll finish the last three talks from Francesca Gasparini, Jonathan Walpole, and Roberto Andorno.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you in 15 minutes.
Thanks for your great questions.
Okay, so hi everyone and welcome back. We're gonna continue our workshop. I think we all can agree this morning's sessions have been really interesting, and I'm sure the afternoon will be the same. So our next speaker is Francesca Gasparini, and she's gonna give a talk together with Aurora Saiben. So Francesca Gasparini is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Milano Bicocca. She's the head of the Multimedia Signal Processing Laboratory. Her research is focused on the processing of multimedia signals and the analysis of the perception of these signals when used as a stimuli in psychophysical experiments. She is particularly interested in the analysis of neurophysiological and psychophysical data using machine learning techniques, genetic programming, and optimization algorithms. Aurora Saibene is a PhD student in computer science at the University of Milano Bicocca, working with Professor Gasparini. Her research is focused on electrophysiological signal processing, analysis and classification, and recently as well on wearable brain-computer interfaces. So welcome, Francesca and Aurora. If you want to share your screen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thanks for all the contribution of this workshop that were really interesting. So now we change the perspective and we move towards the perspective of computer scientist, because we are in the computer science department and we work on data. As you already know, we are in the multimedia signal processing laboratory, and we work on signal acquired from different devices. And in particular, in the last years, we focus on signals coming from wearable devices in order to interpret and recognize the state of the subjects, the behavior of the subjects, and also the tasks that they were doing. For instance, if they are thinking of a movement or if they are doing a movement. So in our laboratory, we have different wearable devices, for instance, an EEG helmet and other devices that are able to collect physiological signals like PPG signal related to heartbeat, or galvanic skin response, or devices that are able to measure the muscle activity, EMG sensors. And we adopt all these devices sometimes in multimodal systems in order to collect information about the subjects. So considering brain-computer interfaces systems, we have from one side the subject, the human being, and from the other side, we have applications, devices that interact with the subjects. So with our devices, with the wearable devices, what we want to do is to acquire signals from the subject that can reveal the state of the subject, the behavior of the subject. And analyzing properly this data, we can interact with devices and applications and give a feedback to the user. So the role of the computer scientist is in the processing and in developing machine learning models that are able to interpret this data coming from the subject. But this data, the data that comes from the subject are raw data, and sometimes these data are not exactly the information that we want. It's it's a problem of noise and artifact. We have to clean this data in order to obtain the real information, the valuable information contained in these signals. So the first step that we have to face is to remove noise and artifact from signals. And this problem is even worse in the case of wearable device, because wearable devices are used within real life environment. And so they are more subject to noise and interference with the environment. So this topic is particularly important in order to obtain information from the signals acquired from the subjects. And the second step we have to face is to learn from data. What does it mean? It means that starting from the signals that are now clean, we have to identify patterns that are related to particular behavior, particular state of the subjects. And we have to describe this pattern considering what we call features, proper characteristics of these signals. And with these features, we can train classifier that will be able to recognize the state of the subject, the task that the subject is doing. So what is the problem within this pipeline? And the problem is that for all the steps from a computer science point of view, for all these steps, we can introduce a modification in the signal. We can corrupt the signal, introducing artifact. Even if we want to remove artifact, we can change the real information related to the signal. We can introduce other information that are not strictly related for the real one that we want to preserve. So it's clear that if we modify these signals during our analysis, both in the phase of preprocessing, trying to remove noise, but also in the phase of machine learning, when we introduce a machine learning model, we change the interaction with the system. And this also causes a change feedback to the subject, a feedback that is not proper for the subject can be dangerous because can interfere with the subject's psychology also. So my point of view, and this is the thing that we want to underline today, is that within this pipeline, we can introduce manipulation of the data that can be accidentally or maybe voluntary, but we have to control this process. So that from the point of view of ethical issues, also within this pipeline, we have the need of a regulation. And also this type of problems is the problem related to ethical issues are multidimensional problems, because they involved all the steps within a human interface interaction. So to go deeper into this aspect, I leave the floor to Aurora Saibene, which studied the EEG data during her PhD, and will try to underline different points within this pipeline and within the use of wearable devices in this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. So let me share the screen. Okay. Can you see the presentation? All right, so we'll start. So thank you so much for inviting us today at this workshop. Actually, we'll talk about brain-computer interfaces and wearables, reliability, ethics, and security from a computer scientist to a multidisciplinary point of view. So just let me give you an outline of the rest of the presentation. Firstly, I will introduce you very quickly to brain-computer interfaces and wearable technologies. Afterwards, we will ask ourselves some questions that brain. Then we will identify some keywords that could allow a discussion on the provided questions, and finally wrap it all up with the conclusions. So let's start from the very beginning. So the electroencephalography, or EEG, has clearly demonstrated its ability to provide an image of the brain activities and functions that could be exploited to translate brain thoughts into machine instructions, and that makes way for brain interface. Some of the main advantages of using BCIs could be represented by improvement of the user's quality of life, which can be translated, for example, in an increase of users' independence, eventually reduce social isolation by opening communication channel, or reduce healthcare costs. Moreover, researchers and manufacturers have become particularly interested in providing easy-to-use and configure wearable devices that could be used even in a home environment that could really change the vision of brain-computer interfacing. One of the first examples that comes to my mind when thinking about these easy purchasable technologies is NeuroSky EEG headset, which could actually be purchased directly from Amazon for about $100, if I recall correctly, together with some Kickstarter apps that regard wellness, emotion recognition, or gameplay. It seems to be pretty easy to use and also fancy with a completely wireless configuration and very discreet appearance. And moreover, I think that it is based on a dry electrode technology. It is minimally invasive and should be sufficiently comfortable. Similar with 5 dry electrodes that can be placed in 1 or 2 minutes. And the motive inside of this device that you can see here is connected to a very common and cost-effective technologies that is Bluetooth and can be used for BCI control. Also, the manufacturer presented this device in many colors. So I think that they want also to please the eye. And this device can be purchased for about $300. However, some questions clearly arises when having the possibility of using these technologies with such ease. So here you can see just a few questions that we could consider when facing the use of EEG-based BCI technologies exploiting wearable devices. Just let me read through them. Are these technologies really up to the challenge of facing the real world? And if they can do so, what kind of applications are they able to manage? Are there any risks in using BCIs? Are there any ethical issues to be considered? Should the security be valued among the benefits deriving from BCI use? Do BCIs only have advantageous characteristics? Well, here I have just written down some main keywords that could come from these questions. And thus we can talk about the wearable technologies reliability and also about neuroethics and neurosecurity. So having cited them before, actually Emotive and NeuroSky have been the first manufacturers to bring easy-to-wear BCIs that are non-invasive to the general public and provided applications to use the BCI about gaming and media interaction or well-being. The industry has also been proposing consumer-grade BCIs available to common devices. Technologies have been exploited to conduct neuromarketing strategies and thus assess customer needs and preferences. So these facts inevitably give way to more questions and issues on the matter. First of all, we can ask ourselves if these applications are really reliable outside the playful domain. So actually, it has been demonstrated that usually wearable devices perform worse than their wired counterpart when dealing with medical applications. And also, sometimes there is a lack of comparisons between wired and wearable devices. And usually when this comparison is performed, the lower performances of wearable technologies seem to be confirmed even when dealing with simple tasks like, for example, the eye state classification. Another point that should be considered is the maturity of the dry technology that makes the use of the commercial wearable devices more comfortable. Actually, it seems that different materials do not influence significantly the final performance of these technologies. However, the fact that these devices are so easily purchasable and that their applications have been taken out to the market make us immediately ask ourselves something about the ethical and security issues coming from them. So beginning from the concept of neuroethics, we have that ILS defined it as a discipline that aligns the exploration and discovery of neurobiological knowledge with human value systems. In the BCI domain, this translates in the practical application of neurobiological knowledge with a focus on the development of technologies that mediate this application. Just taking a look to the net, when dealing with BCI systems, we identify 3 main actors. The BCI experts that actually are coming from an interdisciplinary team composed by engineers, computer scientists, neuroscientists, and so on. The BCI users that are the targets of these applications, and media that actually can influence the masses about the BCIs. So considering a survey performed by Gruber and colleagues in 2013, but I think what they state here actually stands even today, we can make out some concerns, suggestions, and even observation given by these actors. So the BCI experts usually highlight the fact that when presenting a BCI system, it should be immediately clear to the user and to the general public that it has numerous constraints. It may present some drawbacks, and sometimes it could lose importance. Moreover, when making researches, many factors should be considered, like the possible BCI literacy, or the fact that the users usually are asked to make demanding procedures that really can strain their mental health and also their physical health. And also, the BCI experts usually ask themselves about some moral questions on the use of BCI and highlight the importance of defining responsibilities for both the users and the various experts that are involved in the deployment of the BCI systems. Of course, these facts bring us to the problem of security that surely concerns also the BCI users. Actually, the BCI users highlight the fact that using the BCI could be difficult. Some are also frustrated by failures. Others are not comfortable and find them impractical for everyday life. However, especially when the users are patients, they are pretty curious about using such devices for improving their health or help them out in rehabilitation procedures. However, the idea of being able to assess these technologies only in a clinical center may, for example, decrease their motivation in undertaking different kinds of rehabilitation procedures. However, the user's expectation may be blown out of proportions by the mass media. In fact, sometimes happens that researchers and BCI experts report that some journalists have distorted some of the provided information to just publish a catchy story. Then thought we have this kind of ideas and suggestions, you have to consider the fact that we could actually select the really different ethical issues and provide different categorizations of these ethical issues. Actually, I've taken this infographic from the work of Cohen and colleagues, and I think it really summarizes what are the various ethical issues that we have to consider. So we have different factors that are the physical, psychological, and social factors. For what concerns the physical factors, actually, we could have that the user safety can be undermined by the user himself or by a malicious person. Instead, concerning the psychological factors, we actually have to consider the concept of humanity and personhood. We previously seen something about being cyborgs or not, how we feel about using this brain-computer interfacing and so on. And also there is the concept of autonomy, so how much the brain-computer interfaces can help us being independent. Concerning the social factor, actually they are pretty numerous and concern stigma and normality. Stigma, especially when it comes down to talking about patients. We have the concept of privacy and security. We have the fact that informed consent is pretty important benefits of using brain-computer interfaces to the users. And then we have the concept of responsibility and regulation. So just having this long list of factors, we could confidently say that the ethical issues should be considered and addressed by making interdisciplinary effort. That's involving not only ethicists, but also neuroscientists, engineers, computer scientists, cybersecurity experts, and so on. And actually, just using cybersecurity, I just go to the next keyword that is about neurosecurity, that then defined as the protection of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of neural devices from malicious parties with the goal of preserving the safety of a person's neural mechanisms, neural computation, and free will. So actually, this goes out immediately to the concept of brain hacking. The intervention of a malicious actor on the BCIs can involve the manipulation of the input, as Professor Gasparini stated, which means the modification of the signal that is passed on the system for the BCI control. The measurement manipulation that usually involves the output of the BCI and thus may crack the data, disrupt some functions, and so on. Decoding and classifying manipulation that involve, for example, adding noise to the signal or changing machine learning components, and finally feedback manipulation, which could cause physical and psychological harm to the user. For example, let's think about someone that is trying to use a prosthetic arm or a robotic arm. And let's just say that we change how the stimulus is used to control this prosthetic arm. Of course, it will make harm to the user. So the described hacking types clearly bring to numerous implications. First of all, the dual use. What we intend for dual use. Actually, the BCI can be used by malicious person and not only by the users. And also it can provide benefits and risks. So the idea of using safeguards should be developed to provide privacy and security and control mechanisms. The informed consent should clarify the possibility of incurring in a series of risks. Also, the brain hacking could undermine privacy and security issues, so civil liberties, democracy, human rights, and so on. And as previously stated it can affect physical and psychological safety, and also change the concept of autonomy. Actually, in what way? Actually thinking about someone that externally use your own BCI. So having obtained such a broad overview on the neurosecurity topics, I will just talk to you about an example that is this Cody's DemoKit project, which involves a specific device of one of the manufacturers I've talked about before. So let me just claim that this is ineffective since 2016, and that we are just reporting facts without providing any claim on the matter. So first of all, the hacker, Cody Brochus, wanted to exploit the fact that there are devices that are available to the general public. So he chose the Emotive Epoch EEG headset as his target. Secondly, he wanted to read the Emotive EEG Epoch data. And actually, I have just said that one of the Emotive technologies used the Bluetooth technology. That's pretty easy. So what has done Brochus actually has made some Python code to intercept the Bluetooth transmitted data and just fed them without too much effort. So reading an interview that has been made to Brochus in the 2010-2011, the interviewer, Brian Bishop, asked him, what did you think the reaction of Emotive could be? And he actually predicted two outcomes. The first one being ignored, and the second one, Emotive taking an action against him. Actually, I did not find precise information on the matter, but Emotive responded that Brochus' actions, of course, go and undermine all the idea of having an open product that can be used for research, and also violated the user license and forced them to remove this headset from the commerce. So what we can surely say about this situation is that secure devices and software should be always provided, and also people should dialogue between themselves from different interdisciplinary domains. So I think I've talked even too much right now. So let me just summarize what we have talked about in this venue. So first of all, we'll talk about brain-computer interfacing in wearable devices that actually can represent novel with comfortable and cost-effective solutions. Secondly, we have just some questions that actually have triggered three keywords: the reliability of these wearable devices, the neuroethics, and neurosecurity. All right. Their applications to field diverse from playful ones do not provide great performances right now. However, they are surely more comfortable than their wired counterpart. Having such pervasive and consumer-grade devices, of course, we asked some questions about ethics and neurosecurity. So we have identified actors involved in the subject of ethics in the BCI, and provided a general overview of the different factors involved in the BCI ethical issues. Among them, we made a focus on the neurosecurity, which can significantly be undermined by neurocriminals through brain hacking. And we have just seen an example of the security breach right now. So I think that the final message we will take from this presentation is that a multidisciplinary effort is required when talking about ethics and security in neurotechnologies. And for this reason, actually, I'm very thankful to the workshop organizer and to today and tomorrow's speakers for just bringing this topic out to the international venue. And that is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Francesca and Aurora. That was a really interesting set of talks.
Thank you.
So, do any of the other speakers have any questions or comments?
Oh, yeah, I just had this is John Wolpaw. I had a brief comment. I liked the presentation. It was very comprehensive. There's one term in there that I think we should really do away with, though, which is BCI illiteracy, because that implies that there's something wrong with the user. There's something wrong with the person. And almost certainly now, when a BCI doesn't work, it's because there's something wrong with the BCI. These are very primitive devices at this point. And if it doesn't work, the assumption probably for a particular person, it's probably because we aren't analyzing the signals properly, some other reason other than the person. But to put this onus on the person, which illiteracy does, is not really correct. And it has, I mean, it's bad ethically as well. So that term, it's too bad it was ever coined. It really, we really shouldn't use it. But other than that, I liked it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the speakers? So I had one. So you mentioned quite comprehensively, as Jonathan mentioned, all the sort of dangers and risks of these commercial BCI technologies and wearable technologies. And we've even seen similar ones that stimulate the brain. So you can buy commercially devices that can stimulate your brain. So what would be your point of view in terms of the need to restrict these commercial devices, and what do you think are the challenges there?
I don't know if Aurora wants to say something. I think that it's difficult to say that we do not have to commercialize some device, because there are two different effects. One can be a positive effect and the other one can be a negative effect. And if we avoid the use of a device, a commercial one also, maybe we limit also the positive effect. So the effort should be in how we manage all the pipeline from the acquisition to the processing, the feedback, and so on. So I believe that it's not correct to limit the use of a device, but maybe, and this workshop is the idea underlying this point, is that we have to pay attention to each part of the process. And if we are able to control from also an ethical point of view this process, I think we can obtain great results. This is my opinion.
I think it's really intertwined with the concept of responsibility and regulations in this case. Actually, I think there is not much regulation on the matter, so we should wait and just understand how to cope with government and so on. So actually having this much of an interdisciplinary venue is pretty useful for design.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other comments or questions? Okay, so let's thank again the speakers, Francesca and Aurora, and we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much. Okay, so our next speaker is Jonathan Wolpo. He's the director of the National Center for Adaptive Neurotechnologies in Albany Stratton VA Medical Center. His laboratory has developed and is using operant conditioning of spinal reflexes to define apologies for that. His laboratory has developed and is using operant conditioning of spinal reflexes to define the plasticity underlying learning and as a new therapeutic approach to improve walking after spinal cord injury. In addition, his group first demonstrated the usefulness of EEG sensory-motor rhythms for BCI-based communication and control, and extended this to multidimensional movement control. His team also oversees the first large-scale clinical trial of BCI technology for use by people with severe disabilities and has developed BCI 2000, a general-purpose BCI software platform that has been used by over 1,200 research groups throughout the world. These achievements have received wide recognition and numerous national and international awards. So Jonathan, if you want to share your screen.
Oh yes, I don't hear. It'll just be me basically talking.
Perfect.
So yes, I've really appreciated the range of issues brought out here, of neuroethical issues, which I certainly agree with. I want to focus on another aspect of this. The technology is what the development of this technology and the capabilities of it, both BCIs as well as other neurotechnology, receives the most attention, receives a lot of ethical attention, and that's appropriate. But there's another aspect, there's another change over the past half century, which really meshes with that and really deserves attention too, because it brings out other issues of technologies and of BCIs. And that is the fact that we now have a much different understanding of how the brain works than we did 50 years ago. It used to be that we thought the brain was essentially hardwired, that it really didn't change, and chains, memories, et cetera, were stored in very special places, but most of it was hardware. And then when you wanted to do something, the program for it was just downloaded into the hardware. Now that has changed completely over the past 50 years. We now understand that the brain is changing throughout our lives, the entire brain in many different ways. There really is no hardware. The whole brain is plastic. It changes all the time. And the primary cause of that change are the interactions with the world, with the environment. We interact continually with all the various behaviors that we acquire and maintain throughout life, all the way from walking to talking to language to mathematics, et cetera. All these behaviors that we acquire are continually being adjusted and optimized as we go through life. So as we get older, our bodies change and the nervous system changes so that walking stays the same, so that we can still walk just as well as we did before. But the activity underneath has changed. When we get older, when we get heavier, when we grow larger, all these changes occur there through the interactions between the environment and the person, adjust the brain. It's continually plastic. Now these normally, and these interactions all occur through nerves and muscles, so that our sensory inputs come in through our senses. They come in through pathways that have evolved over millions of years. They go out to muscles through the nerves. Those are the outputs that have also evolved. However, what happens with these new technologies that we're developing is that we interact much more intimately with the nervous system. We bypass those pathways. You no longer, your outputs no longer go through muscles to produce the effects you want. They can go through brain-computer interfaces, which take signals directly from the brain. They can either do that by using EEG or some non-invasive method, or you can actually put implants in there and record from individual neurons. Now, all that's very early technology. It's very primitive. All these things are very primitive at this point. And that's important to recognize also, but it will get better. Not real fast, but it will get better. So, and we are interacting, and we can also go in and we can stimulate, we can interact with the brain directly in ways other than producing sensory inputs. We can stimulate nerve cells directly, we can stimulate pathways directly. All these provide new interactions, new, very artificial and very abnormal interactions. We didn't evolve for such sort of interactions. So all these interactions that can be produced now by brain-computer interfaces will presumably produce plasticity. It will induce changes in ways that we can't predict ahead of time. Now, some of these may be good, some may be be bad, potentially. Some of these may have very complex results. The point is, we can't predict these things ahead of time because these are ways of interaction that we have no experience with. They're not the natural ways that this has occurred. So we have to be aware of one of the major issues is that we will be changing the brain in ways we can't predict. New, unusual ways that we can't predict. So there's a real danger there. And the question is, what do we do about it? How do we view it? How do we view it ethically? How do we limit what we do? It's a very difficult question. There's obviously no good answer. And anything you do that's why I really like the fact that the primary focus at the moment is therapeutic. You know, we have our reason for doing this, our justification is that we're going to make people who have various impairments better, right? So, and that's true. And then the normal criterion, the normal guidelines that adjust by which you judge human research can be applied. You don't know exactly what these other dangers are, but you have a reason for doing it because hopefully you're going to help the person. So, but the issue of then moving out into what you do with people who aren't impaired, or what you do about enhancing people, those become much more difficult questions. But there's an even more distant part of that, more really fundamental part of that, then okay, we will be doing things in ways that were not possible before, and we don't really know what kind of changes we're going to produce in this continually really ubiquitously and continually plastic brain that can change throughout our lives. So we don't know that. The other thing beyond that, as this technology develops, right now it's very primitive, and certainly even implants are metal, and they're basically essentially like putting, essentially you're putting beds of nails or very small things into the brain. They can be very finely machined and sophisticated, but it's very foreign material. That will change. There will be better biochemically based, biologically based methods to interface very intimately and in continuous and precise fashions with the brain, to produce plasticity in more sophisticated and more complex ways. The point is that this technology, whether it's implanted or whether it's something you wear on your head, will become part of the nervous system. It will be incorporated, and it will ultimately be indistinguishable from the rest of the nervous system. So you will basically, and then the issue comes up, and again, this isn't going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or next week, but it will eventually happen if this technology continues to develop. The question is, what is the person now? Because we have this very altered system. How do we define a person? I mean, even issues, obviously basic issues such as responsibility, et cetera. How do we define a person? And these are questions that, started to be addressed as far as we know, maybe 3,000 years ago, and have been the issues and the way these things are looked at have been changing since. But this is a whole new aspect to it. What is a person when these devices or these new technologies can be integrated into the CNS, into the central nervous system, and you then have a system that, it's a seamless new system. What do you call this organism? Do you still, I think you still call it a person, but how is that defined? So those are two issues that, I can just bring them out. I don't know how to address them. I don't know the solutions. And the one reassuring thing is that this is going to happen very slowly. The other reassuring thing is that everything we know at this point about what happens when you induce plasticity in various ways using artificial methods is that the system is in fact very sophisticated, and it adjusts. And if you do something that could be bad, by the beginning evidence we have, it will adjust to prevent a unfortunate outcome. These are from animal data, et cetera. It's very robust, and it has been evolved over millions of years. And at this point, it's much smarter than we are, or much beyond the capabilities of our systems. But that may change too, and it may be that bad things will happen, or things that we might not want to happen. So in any case, I thought I would bring that out, and it certainly broadens the issues, and I think raises, certainly philosophically as well as ethically, some very interesting questions for the future. So thank you. I'm interested in what people have to say.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think that was a fascinating topic that you raised as well. Of course, the concept of plasticity and Yeah, I think we had a couple of questions actually on our side. So Marta, one of the co-organizers, I think she wanted to ask you a question.
Yes. Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you very much for this really insightful presentation. I have a question regarding the concept of free will. I mean, I would like to bring into the attention that in his bestseller, Free Will, Sam Harris, the neurologist Sam Harris, ultimately asserts that the modern understanding of the brain reveals us to be biochemical puppets. This is the concept that he uses. This is the term that he uses, biochemical puppets, that can only witness.
Biochemical what? I didn't hear the second.
Biochemical puppets.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that we can only witness what happens in our brains without being really able to do anything about it. I would like to know if this is an oversimplification of what is known to make up the connections, the brain, the thoughts, and ultimately the concept of free will, or if this is actually like this, because in this case, the implications of neurotechnologies are much bigger than what we are actually thinking about at the moment. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not sure exactly when he says we can't do anything about it. I mean, certainly we can go into the nervous system of a human or an animal, certainly, and we can have interactions that will change the system. Now, that can be done biochemically, by drugs, by stimulation. When you stimulate, certainly you're activating biochemical pathways also. So, I mean, we can certainly interact with the system and change what it does. And I think he is probably talking from the point of the individual. The individual, can't really do anything more than, I mean, I agree to some extent that, what we think we're doing or what we think we want to do, it's clear has a very tenuous and probably imprecise and often incorrect relationship to what we're actually doing. There are rehabilitation procedures that are developing that can be very precise, that can do very specific things in a person to make a specific sort of deficit better, and they involve training the person to do something. However, when you ask the person, what are you doing? One person will say, well, I know that I'm thinking about such and such, and the other person will say, I'm thinking about the opposite, and they're both, however, producing the same effect. So what comes out of consciousness and what you actually say may have, or think even, may have virtually no relationship to what's actually happening in your nervous system. So I think maybe that's what he's talking about. But there are certainly ways of going into the nervous system and interacting chemically and electrically, et cetera, with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from our speakers? From the audience?
So yes, I've always been intrigued by, I'm very intrigued by how philosophers look at this, because it really seems like these are issues that haven't really been seriously thought about for several thousand years. We sort of got since people first started to think about them. I think it's bringing out issues that maybe haven't been considered on that very fundamental or initial level for a long time.
And I think Sam Harris was touching on a bit of that as well, philosophically. So I think he refers also to these experiments by Libet some years ago in the 90s, where they showed the conscious responses appeared later than the actual. So you could decode from the brain the intention of the person before the person knew, essentially, like 500 milliseconds before. And so he claims that we are basically just a sort of deterministic chain of reactions that happen, and we do our actions but we become conscious of our actions afterwards, and we're not really deciding them in a way, which is really touching the philosophical. I'm not sure if you come across.
Well, I mean, to some, I mean, clearly what's happening is the result of a physical system. And however, that physical system is not simply responding to what happened a minute ago or 2 minutes ago or 2 seconds ago. No, or it may not relate to, what you actually think you're doing. I mean, it's clear that it's very much, I mean, everything each of us does in a given situation, all of us are nobody's gonna, no two people are gonna do the same thing. No, people are all gonna do it, given the same stimuli, people are gonna act differently. And yes, there are gonna be reasons for that. There are gonna be muscles that did it, there are gonna be neural pathways that did it. But if you look at what the origin is, why you act differently from the way I act in a given situation, it's not the immediate stimulus. The stimulus is the same, but it has to do with our entire previous lives that affect what we do now, in very complex ways. And so that, it's going to be very different. And I mean, ultimately what's happening and what comes out is physical. And you can reduce it to that, but there's many levels of reduction, and it's not this is not, you can't very simply relate it to what's happened in the last minute or 2 minutes or even the day.
Yeah, I don't think he relates just to 1 minute or two, but he's basically claiming the concept of free will that we all have in terms of making decisions. It's not really such, because it depends, as you're saying, on whatever has happened during your life, which is basically genetically and determined by the environment. And so there's like, he questions this thing that we feel that we can do whatever we want at every time. It's not real because it's already determined. I think that's, I don't know if the other speakers want to comment on the.
I would like to just join in the discussion by asking just one last question, given the goal of this workshop and the interest in linking the different disciplines. No, I would like to ask you if you would dare to give us a definition of thought for the purpose of protection, like from a neuroscientific perspective. Is it possible to give us a definition of what a thought is?
Of a thought. Well, I mean, I'm very much hung up on you have to measure. I mean, what science does is measure things. Okay, you measure things, and if we can't measure something, if you can't define something, if you can't say something how you would measure something, then it doesn't have any meaning scientifically. And just to throw this out here, and I'm probably going to regret it, but the whole notion of consciousness is not scientifically addressable at the moment. Okay, it doesn't have a definition. It doesn't have something you observe to say this is consciousness or this isn't. There are things like perception and attention and alertness and awareness. We can define those things. We can say the person is aware of this, or is perceiving that stimulus because she did this. And if she didn't perceive it, then she would have done that. So basically the word consciousness is not needed. So at this point, so what you mean by a thought is dependent on how that thought gets expressed. You say, okay, you write it, or you do it, or you speak it, and it can be that it will be different depending upon how it is recorded, how it is measured. I mean, there are studies done 100 years ago that would be obviously for a lot of reasons unethical now, but people who have various deficits in the brain, certain lesions that produce inability to remember anything for very long. And so they will act particularly very normally if you go in and introduce yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go in the next day, you have to introduce yourself again because they forgot. So there was some work done with people like that. And there was a woman who would know that would happen every day. When you went in, you introduced yourself, you were a new person as far as she was concerned. However, one day, so every day the physician would go in and shake hands, for example. And it would be exactly the same every day. Clearly, it's as if it never happened before. But one day he goes in, and when he shakes hands, he's got a cigarette in his hand, and it burns her hand. Right? So the next day he comes back, and she says, "Hi." No, she acts as if she's meeting him for the first time. But when he puts his hand out, she doesn't put her hand out. She pulls it back. So does she have a thought? She's not thinking he's about to, at least by what she's saying, she's not thinking he's about to burn me because she's saying, hello, I'm happy to meet you, but her hand goes back. So at some level, the nervous system is aware of what happened the previous day, but it's not being expressed in a way that would come out as saying, oh, this is what I'm thinking. But it comes out as an action. So is that a thought? Well, I guess it is. It's being expressed, but it's being expressed in another way. So that's all by way of saying that, you only have all we can do is measure the effects of something. And presumably we could go into the brain and show where there were neurons firing in one situation versus another. We could describe the neurological activity underlying one action versus another. But that's as close as we really get to a thought scientifically.
Thank you so much. We actually have a question from the audience. So Catherine Cecile says, how can we reach BCI literacy of society? I am a German journalist and economist, but no neuroscientist. Even for me, it's quite difficult to understand scientific papers and translate it in an easy way to society. I wish there would be more public engagement of science to have not the same result we are actually fighting in the pandemic. So how do you recommend journalists to get information?
Well, you're definitely very much agree. It'd be really nice, and it seems to be going in the other direction, at least in this country. But in any case, it would be very good. There's basic scientific knowledge that really needs to be conveyed in school at all levels from the beginning. But there are certainly, for a journalist who wants to really be able to, and I've talked to a lot of journalists over the past almost 40 years now about this, and some are very sophisticated. In fact, some really understand the field better than a lot of the people in it, and others know very little. So, but there are basic sources, and a lot of the texts certainly there are introductory chapters. If you really want to learn something about it, you need some basic science and technical knowledge, but it takes some effort, but you can acquire the basic knowledge to be able to understand what the field's doing and to ask intelligent questions and to be able to understand what's new and what isn't new, what the problems are, what some of the issues are. But I agree that really engaging the ethical issues, certainly without a certain amount of actual knowledge, technical and biological and neurological, you can't, I don't really think you can properly engage the ethical issues on a serious level. You don't need, you don't have to be a neurologist or a computer scientist, but you have to have some basic understanding of that. And by the same token, the people actually in the field need, I very much agree with what was said about multidisciplinary, that the field itself, the scientific technical field, has many different disciplines involved. And part of what we've tried to do with our meetings over the past 30 years is to bring these disciplines together and let them learn a little bit about each other. Because you need some basic knowledge in each one of these disciplines if you're going to understand the issues, certainly if you're going to be involved in the development of BCIs, because all these various disciplines have to contribute. And certainly if you're involved in the criticism of them, you really want to know, have some basic knowledge. I mean, we've developed a basic course for that, a several week course but it requires some basic scientific knowledge at the beginning and technical knowledge, but that covers the disciplines and actually sort of culminates with talking about along with commercialization, talking about the ethical issues that all this raises.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So I think we can move on to our last speaker today, Roberto Andorno. So Roberto is an associate professor of biomedical law and bioethics at the School of Law of the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and a research fellow at the Institute of Biomedical Ethics of the same university. He coordinates the PhD program in biomedical ethics and law at the university. From 1998 to 2005, Roberto served as a member of the International Bioethics Committee of UNESCO as representative of Argentina. And he participated in this capacity in the drafting of the International Declaration on Human Genetic Data in 2003 and of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, 2005. Between 2014 and 2016, he was president of the European Society for Philosophy of Medicine and Healthcare, the main academic society in Europe discussing the ethical and legal issues that arise in the medical field. He has published extensively on issues at the interface between bioethics, philosophy, and human rights law. Thank you so much, Roberto. And if you want to share your screen.
Yeah. Thank you, Salvador, and thank you to the organizers for the kind invitation. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a legal scholar and bioethicist. That is why my talk will be a little more maybe abstract or philosophical than the previous ones. The main question I want to discuss, I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yes. Okay. The main question I would like to discuss is, or to argue, is why human rights play or should play a crucial role in responding to the challenge posed by neurotechnologies. As you know, over the past few years, there has been a very lively, interesting discussion about the so-called neuro rights. That is the proposals of developing specific human rights for responding to this challenge posed by neurotechnologies. 4 years ago, I made myself, together with my colleague Marcello Jenka, one of those proposals were discussed. In that paper, we took the notion of cognitive freedom as a starting point, that is the freedom of our minds, and claimed or proposed 3 rights specifically for dealing with these issues. The right to mental privacy, the right to mental integrity, and the right to psychological continuity. One aims to protect the people from the unconsented access and use of their mental data by others. The second aims to prevent harm to our minds. And the third aims to prevent unconsented personality change changes made by third parties, state, the employer, etc., and to protect people's identity. So I will not talk about each of these rights, but I want to take a more, let's say, epistemic approach or philosophical approach to understand how we came up to these rights in particular, and what's the role of human rights in this area, and why I think human rights should play a role in this area. To come up to these three rights, we didn't take a top-down approach, so it was not a purely deductive way of reasoning, but on the contrary, we took a more inductive strategy, bottom-up. We consider first the different technological developments in this area, and we try to identify the human interest, human goods that are at stake. And then, based on that, we develop these three rights. So this is connected with my argument, but before entering into the core of the argument, I think it's important to consider that of course, we are dealing with very difficult question in this debate. First of all, whether we really need new rights in this area, or whether it is enough with appealing to the existing set of human rights. We have many human rights, we have many instruments, human rights instruments, etc. Now, if the answer to the first question is yes, next question is what rights do we need and how to identify them? Then would those rights be absolute, unconditional, or would they be relative, subject to some exceptions or limitations in the interest of society, as it is the case with most rights, in fact? And then another question is how to prevent the risk of rights inflation. Rights inflation is the problematic tendency to label everything that is morally desirable as a right, as a human right. This is problematic because this inflation devalues the notion of human rights. It spreads skepticism about all human rights as if they all were purely rhetorical claims. So this is one point I wanted to mention. Another preliminary point also is what are exactly human rights? In order to decide or to consider whether we need or not to propose, to develop new rights or to expand existing rights to cover this area of neuroscience, I think it's important to consider what are human rights. And I would say, well, this is also a very rich question and field, but I would say that human rights are the most important rights. They are not just one category among others. For instance, contractual rights. That is the rights that we have simply because of the contracts that we may have concluded. Rights, human rights are those rights that we have simply because we are humans, human beings. Human rights are the highest and most precious prerogatives that we might be entitled to because, as I mentioned, they directly relate to our condition, status as persons. Human rights are directly connected to our dignity as persons. International law refers explicitly to this connection with dignity, human rights derived from the inherent dignity of the human person, etc. So this is a very powerful doctrine, of course, and this notion of human rights makes sense if these prerogatives concern the most important conditions that are necessary for leading a minimally good and decent life, and not all possible expectations and wishes that we may have. So in the debate on around rights inflation, for instance, to give some examples, the claim of a right to internet, or the right to holidays paid by the employer, etc. There are many things that the right to freedom from corruption, from governmental officials, etc. All these things are good, of course, but the risk is that the notion itself of human rights doesn't mean anything. If everything is all right, nothing is all right, I would say. So that's the background question. Now, having said that, I would say that the human basic goods or interests that are at stake here in this field of neurotechnologies are, in my opinion, sufficiently important to justify the recognition of new rights in this area, or at least the expansion of the classic rights in this area. So I don't think that there is a problem of rights inflation here. I think that human rights have a legitimate, justified role to play. Why? Because as we have heard in the previous presentations, these new neurotechnological possibilities create unprecedented threats to our freedom of mind, to the privacy of our thoughts, of our mental life, maybe even to our self-determination, to our capacity to make decisions autonomously without the interference, the influence from others. And I think these are really very, very basic, fundamental human goods and interests. Just to give an example, privacy, mental privacy, probably the most obvious value that is at stake here, because many of the new neuro devices imply collecting a large amount of mental data from patients, from research subjects, from users. And all this information, a huge amount of information, could be misused, of course, by malevolent agents, disclosed to third parties, to the state for political purpose, to companies for commercial purposes, and all that without the individual's consent. Well, we can talk a lot about different possibilities of misuse of the technology, but that's not my point. I wanted just to emphasize in this short presentation that there are reasons justifying the resort in appealing to human rights in this area. I come to my conclusions. First of all, of course, neurotechnologies have a great potential to contribute to improve people's quality of life, especially patients, by offering new preventive diagnostic and treatment tools for neurological conditions. But as it happens with many technological developments, there is a potentially dark side. These same technologies create new threats to basic human goods, such as the privacy of our mental life, our mental integrity, our identity. And these goods are extremely important as they directly relate to our personhood, to our dignity as persons. This is why, in my opinion, they deserve to be protected by specific human rights principles. At the same time, I think we have to be modest when proposing new rights in this area in order to avoid the problem of rights inflation. We have to be aware that just formulating rights is not enough to deal with these new unprecedented challenges. So rights have to be, there are other legal tools also, so rights have to be completed with more concrete and immediately operative legal tools, especially I think civil and criminal law offer, of course, more immediate tools for dealing with these challenges. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I think that was really interesting. It added some of the details from the legal perspective, which I think we're going to see more of tomorrow, and it's great to start it now. Do we have any other questions from other speakers or from the audience? So I had one following your conclusion slide. So if I understand correctly, you agree that we might need new human rights to cover these risks, but that we have to be modest and careful about how to implement them. Would you care to comment on the newer rights that have been proposed, as well as on the cognitive liberty that Farhani mentioned?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, the notion of cognitive freedom or liberty, yeah, I'm in favor of it. We took that notion as the basis of these rights in this paper with Marcello Jenker. However, I'm not so much in favor of cognitive freedom in a positive sense, in the sense of a right to mental enhancement of any kind without any limit, etc. So we took in that paper this notion more in the negative sense of the freedom from interference from third parties. Well, having said that, then there are different proposals of neuro rights. I don't like so much the expression neuro rights. I think it's just rights, human rights, but applied to the field of neuroscience. But anyway, I think we have to be modest. This is why, for instance, the idea of the proposal made by Rafael Juste, maybe some of the collaborators, people working with him are present, I don't know. I'm not totally convinced, but some of these rights, the right to against to freedom from algorithmic bias, for instance, I think is too much. It goes too far. I don't think we don't need to formulate a right for that. And also, I think there's a kind of a right to against determinism or something like that. I don't remember the expression. I think this is a very philosophical notion that we are not predetermined. The discussion that was taking place recently. So freedom, this is a very basic notion, a foundation of ethics and law. If we argue that we are determined like robots, puppets, etc., of course, ethics and law don't make any sense anymore. So saying that we have a right to be free from this philosophical point of view, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense. It's not something that is determined by the law, of course. It's a metaphysical question, and well, but we could talk a lot about that. I think there's a question there from Francesco Stocchi.
Yes, I'll read it out. I'll read it out
Oh,
for the audience.
Thank you.
Sorry, Professor Adorno. I'll just read it out for the audience. Can we find an argument for new human rights if we consider the influence and power of the biggest tech company that are investing in neuro devices and operate on a global scale, as they can exert a strong influence on national legislative processes? So I just read it out so that the audience knows you will be answering.
Yes, of course. I think this is one of the reasons, but I couldn't put so much emphasis on this, the power of biggest tech companies. But of course, it's one of the maybe main potential actors of this misuse of technology, because they can have access of big data. You remember maybe the scandal a few years ago with Cambridge Analytica. Facebook sold the data of I don't know, thousands or millions of Facebook users to this private company without the consent of Facebook users, and the same could perfectly happen with this brain data, mental data collected through neurotechnological devices. So, of course, this is one of the risks. Yeah, we will need specific norms or measures to prevent this misuse. Well, there are already some regulations to protect privacy, of course, but the question is that also the technical measures to prevent misuse are in place, if they work, if they are efficient, etc.
Thank you. And I think Marta had another.
Yes, a quick question. I would like to know what do you understand by the concept of mental privacy? I mean, what is to be included, in your opinion, for the purposes of regulation in this concept? Do we include any thought? Do we include thoughts regarding important issues regarding belief, religion? Can we as a society decide to sacrifice some of this privacy for example, to have a safer roads, you know, having people having their minds being read in terms of concentration, to have where do you place the limits from an ethical point of view? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question, a difficult question. I think it's impossible to make a list of thoughts that are valuable and those who can be accessed by third parties. It would be impossible. So in principle, I could say any mental data should be protected. In principle, any mental data should be protected. Is this right, absolute or relative? Are there situations in which we may oblige someone to get his thoughts read? Someone who, for instance, is suspected of a serious crime or of planning a terrorist attack, etc. Personally, I think there could be exceptions, but we should be very prudent with this, because we'll be invading this, let's say, sacred area, intimate domain of the person. So there could be, I think, serious situations in which this could be justified with a court order under certain particular dangers, potential dangers, etc. Okay, that's basically that. I think is not an absolute right. Yeah, I forgot what I wanted to say.
I think Carla, her microphone is on. Carla.
Yes, Marta, thank you. I was, first of all, I want to say that your speech has been really quite insightful and interesting, and I would like to profit of the presence of our speakers to ask a question, a general question. We have heard speaking of the potentialities of this neurotechnology, but also of the risks of this technology. Now, from a legal point of view, we know that the approach of the European Union towards this kind of devices is that of equating them to medical devices. So this is the approach that had been chosen. And this approach has been chosen with a certain favor for the market. We already find some of the headbands that Francesca and Aurora showed us on the market. Would you consider to be inadequate kind of protection for the citizens that afforded by the European Union, equating such devices to medical devices? So for non-invasive headbands like the one we saw, what is required is a declaration of conformity, but nothing more. And I would ask to Professor Wopo, would he ever buy one and use one of those headbands at the moment with what we know now?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the technical aspect, the regulation of these devices, but I would say there are a huge variety of neuro devices that may pose a threat to these basic values that I mentioned. So reducing them to medical devices, I think, does not correspond to reality. Of course, I can have an app to check my mental state, etc. And it's not, as far as I know, it's not considered a medical device. But anyway, these rules, norms about medical devices are not really developed in order to protect all these other values that I mentioned. More, yeah, to ensure the quality of the health service provided, etc. But it's not to protect normal principle, to protect privacy, to prevent the hacking from third parties. So this is a much broader, I would say, much broader concern. So this way, I think we need another kind of regulation, not just limiting, not assimilating these tools to medical devices.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. And I had a question, sort of a general question for all the speakers. Particularly, there might be an interesting point of view from Eduardo Fernandez from the neuroscience, but in general, one of the common criticisms that we see to these neuro rights, for example, the ones that were introduced in Chile in a recent paper, is that the technology is not here yet, so that we are trying to legislate something that doesn't exist, that we cannot read thoughts, and that we might never be able to do it. I'd like to hear your possible response to this.
The law is generally often criticized because it arrives too late. So this is why I would say in this case, it's good if it tries to anticipate potential risk, technological risk. We don't need to wait until these things fully happen, to try to do something. I think we can do something in advance. But I wouldn't see that all these risks as really futuristic or so. Reading minds is to some extent possible, still in a very preliminary stage, etc. But so there are many studies showing that you can know whether the person identifies a place or not, whether the person was in the place or not, recognizes a face or not, or a number. You can know what number the person is thinking, or etc. etc. This I think is this is relevant. So this will develop quickly. So I don't think that this is too science fiction from the point of view of the law.
Thank you. And Eduardo, you want to comment on this as well?
Well, I agree. So it's a difficult question, but also, I mean, right now the technology, I mean, is not good enough for what we are thinking that could make the technology. But I think that it's time to start thinking and start making laws, because right now probably is the right time. But we should be aware that the possibilities of the technology, we are just starting. We have many more problems than real advance. So we are showing that something we can record, we can make a stimulation, but just a few neurons. So even from the neuroscientific point of view, the computation is not the neurons, are the synapses. And every neuron has many thousands of synapses. So right now, the power of computation of the brain is completely impossible. So, and it's not feasible to go in the conscience. I mean, something like that is, I think right now it's not feasible, but it could be feasible in some years. So we should start working as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. I think Professor Racconci had some comments or some questions. Please.
Okay, thank you. Good evening from Italy, from Rome, actually, so it's quite late. I don't want to bother you, but just a short comment starting from what Carla underlined about the European Union approach. Tomorrow I'm going to speak about the approach of international organizations. But this evening, I would like to say, this evening for me, for us in Italy, I would like to say that I believe states are the right level for looking at a regulator. When we speak of this, other similar subjects, but not only when we speak of this, but particularly when we speak of these sensitive topics that I believe are interconnected, such as neuroscience, neurotechnology, artificial intelligence, etc. So without an effort of a group of states, like-minded states, as usual, when we have to start, I believe that binding regulations, as we might expect, is far-reaching to achieve. And that is why I decided to look at international organizations, so the possibility to find a soft regulation, as lawyers, we like to do a distinction between soft and hard law. So soft regulation for a possible unitary response. But I believe that states, but even international organizations, the European Union, are not so interested in finding a common, even minimum level of regulatory response, soft or hard, whatever. I believe that they are trying to find, I don't know, keys to understand this fascinating, innovative topic that is coming from technology, scientists, etc. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much indeed. So,
thank you. I'm not so skeptical about the possibility of an international regulation. At least regarding a soft law instrument, a declaration. And I think, for instance, in the field of genetics, UNESCO has worked on this and was able to reach a consensus on at least some minimal principles. I think something similar could happen with the protection of brain data and all these issues here. So at the level of the European, of the Council of Europe also, I could imagine an additional protocol to the Oviedo Convention on neuroscience and human rights. So that could be binding, a binding instrument. So there are some ways, possible ways. I think. So let's see what happens.
Yes, of course. Sorry, but this is a specific aspect, so I didn't probably specify. I mean, I was thinking of a unitary or something like this. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Theo.
Okay. Thank you so much to everyone. I think we are gonna close the workshop for today. We like to thank all the speakers. I think it's been an amazing workshop day today, really interesting conversations. And tomorrow we will come back with the second day of the workshop. So we're sharing here the schedule for tomorrow. I think we also have a list of amazing speakers. I would just highlight our keynote tomorrow. The opening for the workshop will be by Gabriela Ramos, who's the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Science at UNESCO. We will also have Pia Conchi, who just intervened right now, who's a full professor in international law. I will have Guido Girardi, the Senator of Chile, who was the promoter of this Chilean law on neural rights, the first one in the world. We will also have Silvia Salardi, Professor of Philosophy of Law and Bioethics, Stefania Brandini, Professor of Computer Science, Philip Kalmeyer, who's the Head of Neuroethics and the AI Ethics Lab at Freiburg, and Arlene Stiles, Senior Researcher at the Center for Research of Ethics and Bioethics. So I think the conversation tomorrow will be more focused on the legal aspects, and I think it definitely will be fascinating as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending here today the workshop. And as mentioned, we will make the recording for both days available on YouTube for anyone who missed some of the talks. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow here as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Goodbye and thanks.
Okay. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Okay, thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Stop recording.